There is a piece of paper that was found among the belongings of a dead Soviet marshal, folded small, handwritten in Russian. It was not a battle order. It was not a tactical report. It was a prayer. Oh, the one who can turn night into day and earth into a flower garden, make every difficult thing easy for me and help me. The man who wrote that prayer had, by the time those words were found, watched more men die than most human beings could ever comprehend. He had commanded an army that held a ruined city against one of the most powerful military forces the modern world had ever assembled. He had stood on the western bank of the Volga River, with almost nothing between him and total annihilation, and he had refused to cross to the eastern bank, not because he was ordered to stay, but because he decided to. His name was Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov. He was born the 12th of February, 1900, the eighth child of 12, in a peasant village south of Moscow called Serebryanye Prudy, a name that translates, quietly and without ceremony, as Silver Ponds. He died the 18th of March, 1982, a marshal of the Soviet Union, buried not in Moscow, not in a state cemetery, but at Mamayev Kurgan, the great hill above the Volga, where some of the hardest fighting of the Second World War ever took place. He asked to be buried there, among the men he commanded. Over the next several hours, we are going to follow his entire life. From a factory floor in St. Petersburg when he was 12 years old, through the chaos of revolution, through civil war and the frozen forests of Finland, through the yellow dust of wartime China, and finally into the burning, collapsing city of Stalingrad, a place that by the autumn of 1942 had become something close to the center of the entire world's attention. This is not a simple story. Chuikov was not a simple man. He was rough and demanding, sometimes brutal in the manner of the institution that raised him. He operated inside a system that used fear as a management tool, and he used it too. But he also showed, at a moment when the entire course of the Second World War hung genuinely uncertain, a quality that is extraordinarily rare in any human being under any circumstances: the willingness to stay, settle in, breathe slowly. This story is going to take a long time to tell, and it deserves every minute. Title card: Fall Asleep Too. The entire history of Vasily Chuikov, the man who saved Stalingrad. If you're watching this for the first time, make yourself comfortable. If you've been here before, welcome back. Drop a comment below with where in the world you're watching from tonight. There are people listening to this from Bengaluru, from Berlin, from Buenos Aires, from places Chuikov himself once walked through. That quiet connection across time is one of the reasons we make these. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Village of Silver Ponds. Birth and Boyhood, 1800 to 1917. The village of Serebryanye Prudy sits in the Tula region, roughly 150 kilometers south of Moscow, in a part of the Russian interior that has spent most of recorded history being unremarkable. It is flat country, quiet country, the kind of place where the rhythms of agricultural life, planting, harvesting, freezing, thawing, repeat themselves year after year with an almost geological patience. It was into this world that Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov was born on the 12th of February, 1900, the eighth of 12 children born to a peasant family with very little money, very little land, and very little reason to expect that any of their children would one day become a marshal of the Soviet Union. That is not a criticism of the family. It is simply the statistical reality of a peasant household in the late Russian Empire. What we know about Chuikov's childhood is partial, as it tends to be with people who were not famous yet when they were young. The family home was ordinary by the standards of the village, which were themselves modest by any standard. 12 children in any household means a great deal of noise, a great deal of negotiation over food and space, and a childhood shaped more by the needs of the collective than the preferences of the individual. That experience, learning very early that your personal comfort is secondary to what the group requires, may not be the worst possible preparation for commanding an army under siege. It does not make the childhood easier, of course, but it shapes a particular kind of person. Chuikov left school after completing 4 grades at the parish school. He was 12 years old. This is the kind of fact that tends to be mentioned in passing in military biographies, usually as a precursor to the more exciting material, but it deserves a moment of attention on its own. At 12, in the final years of the Russian Empire, a peasant boy leaving school to earn wages was not unusual. It was the norm. The Russia of that era was still, in almost every statistical measure, a pre-industrial agrarian society, with a thin layer of urban modernity painted over the top. Chuikov left Serebryanye Prudy and travelled to Petrograd, the city that had been St. Petersburg until the First World War made the Germans' sounding name politically uncomfortable, and found work in a factory workshop, turning out spurs for cavalry officers. He was manufacturing with his hands the equipment of an army that would shortly cease to exist entirely. There is something genuinely strange about that image, if you hold it in your mind. A 12-year-old boy from a village called Silver Ponds, sitting in a factory in the imperial capital, making spurs for cavalry horses in the last years of an empire that had maybe 5 years left before it collapsed entirely. He had no way of knowing any of that, of course. He was simply working. The work was physical, the hours were long, and the pay was small. All of that was true of almost everyone around him. Russia in the years between 1912 and 1917 was a country under enormous pressure. Pressure from a catastrophic world war that was killing its soldiers at a rate the country could not sustain. Pressure from a political system that had proved unable to reform itself fast enough to address the grievances of its population. And pressure from the simple fact of hunger, which is a very effective engine of political radicalization. The Russian Revolution of 1917 came to Petrograd before it came anywhere else, and Chuikov was in Petrograd when it arrived. He was 17 years old. The city in 1917 was a place of extraordinary intensity. Political meetings happening in every courtyard, newspapers and pamphlets produced and distributed with frantic energy, arguments about the future of Russia conducted at enormous volume in every public space. For a 17-year-old factory worker with no particular political education, but a very immediate experience of what it meant to be poor in the Russian Empire, the moment must have been both terrifying and electrifying. When the revolution came in earnest, Chuikov found himself unemployed. The factory work dissolved in the upheaval, and at loose ends in a city that was reorganizing itself at tremendous speed. An older brother, already connected to the new revolutionary structures, arranged for Chuikov to be recruited into what was then called the Red Guards. This was the armed force of the Bolshevik movement in those early, chaotic months before the formal structures of the Red Army existed. By December of 1917, Chuikov was in military service, a cabin boy, as one source describes him, with a detachment of miners in Kronstadt, the naval fortress island west of Petrograd. He was 17, barely trained, in a country that had just torn itself apart. The cavalry spurs he had been making in the factory. For an army that no longer existed, for an empire that had been dissolved, were already a relic of another world. Everything was moving very fast. What is worth noting here, before we move forward, is how ordinary this trajectory was for a young man of Chuikov's background in that specific historical moment. He was not a committed Bolshevik ideologue who had spent years studying Marx. He was a boy who needed work, then needed to belong to something in a time when the something available was the Red Army. The historian Catherine Meredale, in her work on the ordinary Soviet soldier, has written extensively about how many of the Red Army's eventual officer corps came from precisely this kind of background. Not ideological conviction, but practical circumstance. That is a useful corrective to the tendency to retroactively impose a political biography onto people whose early decisions were far more immediate and personal than they later appeared. Chuikov joined because his brother arranged it. What he did with that fact over the next 6.5 decades is the story we are telling tonight. He graduated from the Red Army's military instructor courses in 1918. He was 18 years old, had completed 4 years of parish school, and was now an officer of a revolutionary army, fighting for the survival of a government that itself was barely a year old. The Russian Civil War was beginning in earnest, and Vasily Chuikov was about to find out, for the first of many times, what he was made of. The village of Silver Ponds, 200 kilometers behind him now, would recede further and further into the distance. He would not live as a peasant's son again. He would live as a soldier. That transition, quiet and unremarkable at the time, was permanent. There is a line worth pausing over here before we move to the Civil War. Chuikov and all of his brothers, and there were several of them, became soldiers. Every single one. The family of Serebryan Prudy contributed its sons to the successive upheavals of 20th century Russia with a completeness that was statistically remarkable. Whether that reflects the patriotism of the family, the pressures of the times, or simply the reality that in revolutionary Russia, the military was one of the only institutions through which a peasant's son could find advancement, we genuinely cannot say with certainty. Probably all three. What it produced, in Vasily's case, was a man whose entire adult life, from the age of 17 until he was finally retired in 1972, would be organized entirely around the military institution. He knew no other world. In some ways, that is the key to understanding everything else that follows. Chapter 2, The Fire That Taught Him. The Russian Civil War, 1918 to 1922. The Russian Civil War is one of the least understood major conflicts of the 20th century, outside of the countries that lived through it. And even within those countries, the historiography has gone through multiple revisions as political circumstances have changed. What is not disputed is the scale. It was a catastrophic, multi-sided conflict that consumed much of the former Russian Empire from roughly 1917 through 1922, involved foreign intervention from multiple powers, produced famine, mass displacement, and casualties in numbers that are still debated by historians today. For a young officer of the newly formed Red Army, it was a brutal education compressed into a very short time. And it was in this war that Vasily Chuikov first showed the qualities that would eventually define him. In October of 1918, Chuikov was sent to the Southern Front as a deputy company commander, tasked with fighting against the White Army forces in that region. He was 18 years old. The Southern Front was one of the most active theatres of the Civil War, partly because of the strategic importance of the region's agricultural land and its access to the Black Sea, and partly because it was where some of the most capable White Army commanders were operating. For a young officer still essentially learning his trade, being posted to an active front in the autumn of 1918, was a comprehensive and unforgiving introduction to combat. The following spring, in 1919, Chuikov was moved to the Eastern Front, where he was given command of the 40th Regiment, later redesignated the 43rd. As part of the Fifth Army operating under the command of Mikhail Tukhachevsky facing the White Army forces under Admiral Alexander Kolchak in Siberia. This was a significant command for a 19-year-old. A regiment in that period typically comprised several hundred men, sometimes more, and commanding one required not just tactical skill, but a capacity to hold the confidence of men who were themselves often frightened, hungry, and uncertain about what they were fighting for. Chuikov apparently could do this. The record of his Civil War service was described, by those who examined it later, as distinguished. He was wounded 4 times during the Civil War years. The 4th wound, received during fighting in Poland in 1920, left a metal fragment embedded in his left arm, a fragment that could not be safely removed by the surgery available at the time. The wound caused partial paralysis of the arm and temporarily cost Chuikov the use of it. More significantly, from a medical perspective, it caused a chronic condition that stayed with him for the rest of his life. 61 years later, in 1981, the fragment in that arm led to septicemia, a systemic blood infection that kept him ill for 9 months and ultimately caused his death. The Civil War killed him, in a sense, on a 50-year delay. For his conduct during the fighting from 1919 to 1920, Chuikov received 2 awards of the Order of the Red Banner. This was, at that time, one of the highest military honors the Soviet state could confer, and receiving it twice by the age of 20 was genuinely unusual. It indicated that Chuikov's performance in combat had been noticed and assessed positively by people in a position to make that judgment. But the awards also need to be understood in context. The Civil War Red Army was an institution with enormous personnel losses, constant organizational upheaval, and a desperate need to identify and promote capable junior officers as quickly as possible. The bar for advancement was, in some respects, simply the ability to survive and function effectively, while a very large number of people around you were failing to do either. What the Civil War gave Chuikov, beyond the wounds and the medals, was something harder to quantify. It gave him a practical understanding of what combat actually looks like at close range, under the worst possible conditions. Poor logistics, uncertain communications, low morale, inadequate equipment, commanders who sometimes broke under pressure and needed to be replaced immediately. He saw all of this at an age when most people are still in formal education. He learned, from direct experience rather than academic study, how organizations collapse and how they hold together, what makes men stay in position and what makes them run. This knowledge, uncomfortable, empirical, deeply unglamorous, would turn out to be exactly what the situation at Stalingrad required 2 decades later. There is a historiographical note worth making here, for those who are still awake and interested in the academic dimensions of this story. The rehabilitation of various Civil War figures in Soviet historiography is a complex subject, and Chuikov's Civil War record was written and rewritten across several decades, depending on the political climate. Some of the unit designations and precise operational details in the various sources differ slightly, which is consistent with the general archival challenges associated with Red Army records from this period. What the sources agree on is the basic shape. He fought, he led, he was wounded, he was decorated, and he emerged from the Civil War as a junior officer with a solid enough reputation to continue advancing through the Soviet military system. The specific heroics are, in some cases, partially obscured by time. The trajectory is clear. By 1921, the Civil War was effectively concluding, though the formal end was not declared for another year, and Chuikov left his regiment to continue his education. He was 21 years old. He had been fighting, with brief interruptions, for nearly 3 years. He had a metal fragment in his left arm, 2 orders of the Red Banner, and the kind of self-knowledge that comes from having been genuinely afraid and having kept going anyway. He enrolled at the Frunze Military Academy, the Red Army's premier institution for officer development, and he would spend the next several years there, exchanging the field for the classroom, the regiment for the lecture hall. It is worth pausing here and noticing what kind of person is sitting in those Frunze Academy classrooms in the early 1920s. They are, almost without exception, men who entered military service through the revolution, who learned their craft in the middle of a civil war, who carry wounds, and who have seen things that no formal military education could have prepared them for. The Frunze Academy was teaching doctrine to people who already had practical knowledge of what doctrine looked like when it met reality. That combination, theory and hard-won experience, would produce, over the following 2 decades, the officer corps that ultimately fought and won the Second World War on the Eastern Front. Chuikov was part of that generation. He was one of its more interesting specimens. The silver ponds of his childhood were very far away now. The boy who made spurs in Petrograd was gone entirely, replaced by something considerably harder and considerably more capable. What would come next, China, Finland, and eventually the Volga, was still many years away. But the essential substance of Vasily Chuikov, the qualities that would later define his command at Stalingrad, were formed here in the chaos of a civil war that he survived 4 times when he might easily not have. Chapter 3. The Classroom and the Far East. The Frunze Academy and First China Mission, 1921 to 1929, the MV. Frunze Military Academy in Moscow was, by the 1920s, the institutional heart of the Red Army's officer development program, named for Mikhail Frunze, the Bolshevik military commander who died in 1925, under circumstances that have never been entirely clarified. The academy operated as both a war college and a research institution, developing doctrine and training the officers who would be expected to implement it. Getting into the Frunze Academy required demonstrated ability. Staying and performing well required something more. The kind of disciplined intellectual engagement that could seem, on the surface, quite different from the instinctive reactive leadership that combat demands. Chuikov did both. He graduated in 1925, and his academic performance was, by the available accounts, strong enough to earn him an unusual distinction. Because of his excellent academic performance, Chuikov was invited to remain at the Frunze Military Academy for an additional year after his graduation. The purpose was specific. The academy wanted him to study Chinese language and history in the Orient Studies department. This is one of those details that deserves more attention than it typically receives in summaries of Chuikov's career. The Soviet military in the 1920s had a genuine and sophisticated interest in China, partly for ideological reasons, connected to the global ambitions of the Comintern, and partly for strategic reasons, connected to the long Soviet border with China and the complex geopolitics of the Far East. Training an officer with demonstrated capability specifically in Chinese language and culture, was not a casual decision. It was a deliberate investment. Someone, somewhere in the Soviet military bureaucracy, looked at Chuikov's record and decided he was worth developing for a specific purpose. In the autumn of 1926, Chuikov joined a Soviet diplomatic delegation that toured the cities of northeastern and northern China. Harbin, Changchun, Port Arthur, Dalian, Tianjin, Beijing. He was 26 years old, traveling through a country in the middle of its own political upheaval, which in the mid-1920s meant the chaotic and violent process of the nationalist movement, attempting to unify China against warlordism, and the growing confrontation between the Nationalist Party and the Chinese Communist Party. It was a complicated political environment for any foreign observer to navigate. And for a Soviet military officer, navigating it required not just language skills, but genuine cultural and political intelligence. Chuikov spent the year traveling extensively in southern China and the Sichuan region, becoming fluent enough in Chinese to operate without a translator, and developing an understanding of Chinese politics that went beyond the schematic version available in Moscow. After completing his studies in the autumn of 1927, Chuikov was formally dispatched to China as a military attaché. The role of a military attaché is, on the surface, a diplomatic one, official representation of one country's military to another. In practice, particularly in the 1920s and 30s, it involved intelligence gathering, assessment of foreign military capabilities, and, often, covert advisory functions. Chuikov traveled widely during this posting, developing relationships and gathering information in a country that was, by any measure, one of the most important strategic considerations in the Soviet Union's external planning. The assignment also gave him something that proved surprisingly valuable later: direct, personal experience of what a military force looks like when it is fighting in an urban environment against a more technologically sophisticated adversary. That observation would take years to become relevant. But the mind that had made it was still there, carrying it when Stalingrad arrived. The first China posting ended abruptly in 1929. The cause was the China Eastern Railway incident, in which a dispute over the management of the Chinese Eastern Railway, a railway line in Manchuria that was jointly managed by the Soviet Union, and the Republic of China, escalated into open-armed conflict between Soviet and Chinese nationalist forces. The Soviet Union broke diplomatic relations with the Republic of China on the 13th of July, 1929, and Chuikov, as a Soviet military attaché, was forced to leave. He was sent to Khabarovsk in the Soviet Far East, where he was assigned to the newly formed Special Red Banner Far Eastern Army. There, working in military intelligence and reporting to the army commander Vasily Blucher, he participated in the operations that ended the conflict and restored Soviet control of the railway. The China Eastern Railway incident is a small conflict in the global historical consciousness, dwarfed in almost every discussion by what came before and after it on the Eastern Asian stage. But for Chuikov, it was another layer of experience. His first taste of what it looked like when two states that were nominally not at war conducted genuine military operations against each other in a contested border zone. The strategic ambiguity of the situation, the violence that existed in the space between formal peace and declared war, was a pattern he would encounter again more dramatically in the years ahead. And working under Blucher, one of the Soviet Union's more capable and experienced commanders, was itself an education. Blucher, it is worth noting, was later arrested and killed in the purges of 1938. The world Chuikov moved through was not a stable one. Back in the Soviet Union, in the early 1930s, Chuikov continued his professional development within the Red Army's institutional structures. He graduated from the academic courses at the Military Academy of Mechanization and Motorization in 1936, a significant additional qualification that reflected the Soviet military's intensive investment in armored and mechanized warfare during that decade. From 1936, he commanded a mechanized brigade, and from April of 1938, he commanded a rifle corps of the Belarusian Special Military District. These were substantial commands, at a substantial rank in the most operationally significant part of the Soviet military's Western force structure. The 1930s were, for the Red Army, a decade of simultaneous modernization and institutional catastrophe. The officer corps was being professionalized, equipped with new doctrine and new hardware, even as Stalin's purges tore through its upper ranks with devastating effect. The precise impact of the purges on Chuikov personally, how close the danger came, whether he was ever investigated, what he knew about the fates of colleagues, is not something the available sources address in detail. What the record shows is that he survived the decade in command, which is itself a notable fact. Many officers of his generation and rank did not. By 1939, Chuikov was commanding army-level formations. He led the Fourth Army during the Soviet invasion of Poland in September of 1939. The Soviet entry into eastern Poland following the German invasion from the west was, in military terms, conducted against minimal organized resistance and was completed quickly. It was not a test of Chuikov's tactical capabilities under pressure, but it placed him in command of a large combined arms force in the field, with all the logistics, communications, and coordination challenges that entails. At a moment when the Soviet Union was about to enter a period of far more demanding military operations, the Poland campaign was, in a sense, a rehearsal. Though the audience watching was not yet aware of what the main performance would look like, what is emerging here, across this chapter and the one before it, is a portrait of someone who accumulated experience with unusual breadth. By the time he was 40 years old, Chuikov had fought in a civil war, studied at an elite military academy, lived in China, worked in military intelligence, managed a border conflict in the Far East, commanded a mechanized brigade, commanded a rifle corps, and led an army in a brief but real operational campaign. There is a word for that kind of accumulated practical knowledge. Seasoned is probably the most accurate, and while it is a common word in military biography, it applies with genuine precision here. He was not a theorist who had been given operational command. He was an operator who had been given the theoretical grounding to understand what he was doing. That combination is rarer than it looks. Chapter 4, The Frozen Forest, The Winter War with Finland, 1939 to 1940. The Soviet-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940 is one of the more uncomfortable episodes in Soviet military history, and it remains one of the more instructive ones. In late November of 1939, the Soviet Union launched what it clearly expected to be a brief and decisive military operation against Finland, with the aim of securing a buffer zone that Soviet strategic planners believed was necessary to protect Leningrad, which sat within artillery range of the Finnish border. What followed was not brief and not decisive. The Finns, numerically outnumbered and outgunned in almost every conventional measure, defended their territory with a combination of tactical skill terrain knowledge, and organizational cohesion that repeatedly stopped the Soviet advance and, in several cases, produced catastrophic Soviet defeats. The international embarrassment was significant, and the military lessons were sharper and more important. Vasily Chuikov commanded the Ninth Army during the Winter War. The Ninth Army was one of the formations tasked with advancing through the central and northern sectors of Finland, areas of dense forest, deep snow, minimal roads, and brutal cold that regularly dropped below -40 degrees. This was not the terrain where Soviet combined arms doctrine, built around mechanized warfare on open ground, could function effectively. The forests broke up formations. The cold seized equipment. The roads, where they existed at all, were the only paths of advance, which meant they were also the only paths of ambush. The Finnish tactic of Motti, surrounding and isolating Soviet columns in the forest, cutting them off from supply and support, proved devastatingly effective against units that had been designed for a completely different kind of war. The Ninth Army's experience in the Winter War was, by any honest measure, difficult. Several Soviet divisions were encircled and effectively destroyed in the forests of central Finland. The 44th Division, attempting to relieve the encircled 44th. There is some variation in the sources here on precise unit designations, which reflects ongoing archival work on this campaign, suffered catastrophic losses. The overall Soviet performance in the first phase of the Winter War was, as multiple post-war Soviet military analyses acknowledged, well below acceptable standards. The reasons were structural. The purges had removed experienced senior officers. The doctrine was ill-suited to the terrain. The logistics were inadequate, and the intelligence about Finnish defensive preparations had been systematically wrong. What Chuikov took from the Winter War is, as with so many of the formative experiences in his career, partially inferential. The direct sources do not give us a detailed account of his private assessment of the campaign. What the sources do show is that he was present for and responsible for a significant portion of the Soviet operations in that theatre, and that the operations encountered severe difficulties. A commander of Chuikov's experience and intelligence, and by 1939, he had 20 years of military experience, could not have observed what happened in the Finnish forests without drawing conclusions. The conclusions that the Winter War forced on reflective Soviet officers were stark. Combined arms coordination was broken, command culture was wrong, and the assumption that numerical and material superiority would automatically translate into victory had been comprehensively disproved. The Winter War ended in March of 1940 with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland retained its independence, but ceded significant territory in the Karelian Isthmus and elsewhere. The Soviet Union had achieved its minimum strategic objectives, but at a cost, in lives, in equipment, and in international reputation that no one in Moscow could be comfortable with. The German military was watching carefully. The conclusions German planners drew from the Winter War about the Red Army's capabilities would, 18 months later, influence their planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union. Some historians argue that the Soviet military's apparent fragility in Finland encouraged a degree of strategic overconfidence in Berlin that proved, ultimately, fatal. That is a large claim, and a debated one, but it is not an unreasonable reading of the available evidence. For Chuikov personally, the Winter War was followed almost immediately by another assignment to China. In December of 1940, he was appointed Chief Soviet Military Representative to the Republic of China and personal advisor to Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader in Chongqing. This was a return to familiar territory. both literally and professionally. And it came at a moment of considerable strategic complexity. The Soviet Union was not yet at war with Germany, though the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that had created a nominal non-aggression arrangement between the two states was already looking fragile, in ways that serious analysts on both sides were beginning to acknowledge. The Soviet interest in China was, at this moment, deeply connected to the question of Japan. If Japan could be kept engaged in China, it was less likely to turn its attention northward toward the Soviet Far East. Before Chuikov left for China, he was summoned to meet Joseph Stalin directly, along with Defense Commissar Semyon Timoshenko. This is one of the few documented moments in which Chuikov and Stalin were in the same room, and the instructions he received in that meeting are instructive. Stalin told Chuikov to ensure that China remain actively engaged in its war with Japan. He told him to prioritize support for the nationalist government over the Chinese communists, a position that created, as we will see, some immediate complications on the ground. And he told him, in essence, that the purpose of Soviet military assistance to China was not primarily to help China, but to manage Japan, to keep the Japanese army tied down on the Asian mainland, where it could not threaten Soviet interests in the Far East. Chuikov was not being sent to China as a humanitarian advisor. He was being sent as an instrument of Soviet grand strategy. The Winter War and the Second China Mission, taken together, represent the last phase of Chuikov's pre-Stalingrad education. He was 40 years old when he returned from China in March of 1942. He had spent the previous 2.5 years watching the Soviet Union perform poorly in Finland, and then managing a complex advisory role in a country at war with a power that was, by any measure, formidable. He had been wounded in a civil war and carried the consequences in his left arm. He had commanded an army in Poland and another in Finland. He had worked in intelligence, spoken Chinese, advised a foreign head of government, and watched from a distance as the Soviet Union was nearly destroyed in the first year of the German invasion. There is a version of this biography that asks, could anyone have been better prepared in the specific ways that mattered for what was about to happen at Stalingrad? The answer, honestly considered, is probably not. He was recalled from China in March of 1942 and returned to the Soviet Union, which by then was fighting for its life. Germany had invaded in June of 1941. The first winter on the Eastern Front had been catastrophic for the Wehrmacht, but had not broken it. The spring of 1942 was bringing a new German offensive, and the direction it would take, south, toward the Caucasus and its oil, toward the Volga and its symbolic and strategic significance, was becoming clear to Soviet planners. The city on the Volga that the war would center on had been named Tsaritsyn when Chuikov first heard of it, then renamed Stalingrad when Stalin rose to power. And it was about to become, for a few months in the autumn and winter of 1942, the most important single location on Earth. Chuikov was driving back toward it, though he did not yet know that. Not yet. Chapter 5. The Second China Mission, Chongqing, 1940 to 1940. Toward Chongqing in the winter of 1940 was a city existing at the outer edge of its own capacity. The nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek had retreated there from the eastern coast of China as Japanese forces advanced, and the city, perched dramatically above the confluence of the Jialing and Yangtze rivers in the fog-shrouded mountains of Sichuan, had become both the wartime capital of the Republic of China and a symbol of resistance to Japanese occupation. It was bombed regularly by Japanese aircraft. It was crowded with refugees, government officials, diplomats, soldiers, and the entire apparatus of a government that had been forced to operate under permanent emergency conditions. Into this environment, in December of 1940, arrived Vasily Chuikov, accompanied by a substantial supply of Soviet military hardware: tanks, artillery pieces, fighter and bomber aircraft, and trucks, delivered in support of the nationalist war effort. The Soviet-nationalist relationship in this period was one of the more intricate diplomatic arrangements of the early Second World War. Stalin's was supporting Chiang Kai-shek's government not because of any ideological sympathy. The nationalists and the communists had spent much of the previous decade fighting each other, but because of China, actively at war with Japan, served Soviet strategic interests. A Japan bogged down in China was a Japan that was not threatening the Soviet Far East. Chuikov understood this calculus precisely. Stalin had explained it to him personally before his departure. His job in Chongqing was to keep the nationalists supplied, and, more importantly, to keep them fighting, to discourage any negotiated settlement with Japan that might free up Japanese forces for redeployment northward. The problem with this assignment was that it immediately put Chuikov in the middle of the most bitter political fault line in Chinese society. The tension between the nationalist government and the Chinese Communist Party, which was formerly the nationalists' partner in a united front against Japan, but which, in practice, the nationalists viewed with deep suspicion. In January of 1941, that tension erupted into actual armed conflict when nationalist forces attacked the communist New Fourth Army in what became known as the Southern Anhui Incident. The attack was a significant breach of the nominal alliance between the two parties and created a crisis that threatened to fragment Chinese resistance to Japan entirely. Chuikov was criticized directly by Mao Zedong for failing to prevent the attack. He met with communist leaders Zhou Enlai and Ye Jianying to address the situation, insisting that Soviet weaponry could not be used against the communists. But in keeping with Stalin's explicit directives, he continued to support the nationalist war effort, even after the incident. It was the kind of situation in which there was no clean option, only a hierarchy of bad ones. The quality of Chuikov's advice during his time in Chongqing is difficult to assess comprehensively, but there is at least one documented instance of it that is worth noting. In September of 1941, during the Second Battle of Changsha, a major Japanese offensive against the city of Changsha in Hunan province, Chuikov advised Chiang Kai-shek to relieve the pressure on Changsha not by direct reinforcement, but by attacking the strategic city of Yichang, roughly 400 kilometers to the north. The strategy succeeded. It was the kind of operational thinking that takes a particular kind of geometric imagination, the ability to look at a map under pressure and identify the pressure point that, when pushed, resolves the problem somewhere else. It was advice that worked, given in a foreign country, in a foreign language, in the middle of a complex and multi-sided war. That is not a small thing. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, signed in April of 1941, created an additional layer of complexity for Chuikov's position. The pact was a pragmatic arrangement between two powers that both had reasons to avoid a two-front war. The Soviet Union was preparing for the possibility of conflict with Germany, and Japan was preparing for expansion into Southeast Asia. For Chuikov, the pact meant that the official Soviet relationship with Japan had shifted toward formal neutrality, even as he was actively supporting a country at war with Japan. The situation required the kind of diplomatic sensitivity that is not always the first thing military historians associate with a man whose later reputation was built on the directness and occasional brutality of his Stalingrad command style, but Chuikov managed it, navigating between his directives from Moscow, the demands of the nationalist government, the criticisms of the communist leadership, and the shifting strategic landscape for the better part of 2 years. And then Germany invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941. Chuikov was in Chongqing when it happened. He was roughly 7,000 kilometers from the front. Everything he had spent his career preparing for, the contingency that Soviet military planning had been organized around since at least the mid-1930s, was now not a contingency but a reality. And he was in China, advising a foreign government, watching from the other side of the world, as the largest military invasion in history unfolded. The German advance in the summer of 1941 was staggering in its speed and depth. By the time the first Soviet winter stopped the Wehrmacht outside Moscow, in December of 1941, the Red Army had suffered losses in men and equipment that no military had ever sustained and survived. What Chuikov felt during those months, watching from Chongqing, as the country he had served his entire adult life was nearly destroyed. The sources do not tell us directly. What we know is that he remained at his post, continued his advisory work, and did not ask to be recalled. He was, by training and by temperament, a man who did the job in front of him. The job in front of him was China. The job behind him, the one he was not yet doing, was the war. He waited. He waited. In March of 1942, the recall came. The Soviet military situation had stabilized somewhat after the first catastrophic summer and autumn, but the spring of 1942 was bringing a renewed German offensive, and the Red Army needed experienced officers. Chuikov was ordered back to the Soviet Union. He left Chongqing, crossed the vast distances of Central Asia, and arrived in a country that was physically and psychologically exhausted from 8 months of fighting on a scale that no planning had fully prepared for. He was assigned first to command the 1st Reserve Army, which was redesignated in July of 1942 as the 64th Army. Then, in September of 1942, came the assignment that would define everything, the one that would put his name in every history book written about the Second World War. He was summoned to a headquarters meeting on the 11th of September 1942 to discuss a city called Stalingrad. The city on the Volga was burning. The German Sixth Army was pressing into it from the west. The Soviet forces defending it were depleted, disorganized, and in some cases already retreating. Someone needed to hold that city. Someone needed to go in and make it hold. The choice fell on the 42-year-old general from Silver Ponds, who had been fighting since he was 17, who had been shot 4 times and carried a metal fragment in his arm for 20 years, who spoke Chinese and knew what it felt like to advise a losing side, who had watched a civil war from the inside and a winter campaign in Finland from a command tent, and who had, at some point in his formation, decided that retreating was not something he was built for. "I'll either keep them out of Stalingrad," he told his superiors when they asked what he thought, "or I'll die trying." The tea they offered him after that he declined. Chapter 6. The Summons. Being given command of the 62nd Army, September 1941. The meeting on the 11th of September 1942 took place at Southwestern Front headquarters. The 2 men who summoned Chuikov were Lieutenant General Andrei Yeryomenko, the Southwestern Front commander, and Commissar Nikita Khrushchev, the same Khrushchev who would, more than a decade later, stand before the 20th Congress of the Communist Party and deliver the speech that began the process of reckoning with the Stalin era. In September of 1942, none of that was visible. What was visible was the military map of Stalingrad, and the map was not encouraging. The city of Stalingrad ran for roughly 80 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga River. A long, thin industrial city rather than a compact one, its length determined by the river and the bluffs above it rather than by any natural tendency toward concentration. The tractor factory in the north, the Red October steel plant, and the Barricady gun factory in the center north, the enormous grain elevator in the south. These were the major industrial landmarks, and they were also the landmarks that the battle would be fought around and through. Over the following months, the Germans had been pressing against the city from the west. Since late August of 1942, by the time of Chuikov's appointment, they had already reached the Volga at several points, cutting the 62nd Army off from direct overland connection with the rest of the Soviet forces. The 62nd Army, at the moment Chuikov was given command of it, was not the force it would eventually become. Several of its most senior officers had already retreated across the Volga to the eastern bank, including, by Chuikov's own later account, 3 of his deputies, whom he found absent when he arrived at army headquarters. The units that remained on the western bank were depleted, in some cases barely functioning as organized formations. The Germans were pressing from the northwest toward the main train station and Gumrak airfield, and from the southwest toward the grain elevator. The situation, assessed honestly, was close to collapse. Chuikov's account of arriving at 62nd Army headquarters on the 14th of September 1942 is one of the more striking pieces of self-assessment in the available record. He describes finding only 3 reliable people present: his chief of staff, his political commissar, and his chief of artillery. He describes the absence of dependable combat units. He describes the immediate decisions he made about command authority and discipline, including actions against officers who had abandoned their positions. The directness of this account, written in memoirs published after the war, when self-serving retrospective clarity is a known occupational hazard of military memoir, is either genuinely honest or very carefully constructed to appear genuinely honest. Most serious historians of the Eastern Front who have worked with the available Soviet archival material tend toward the former reading with appropriate caution about the details. What Chuikov did in the first days of his command was, in essence, an emergency reconstruction of a military organization in the middle of a battle. He stabilized the command structure. He established clear lines of authority. He moved his headquarters to a position that put him on the same side of the Volga as his troops. A decision that was tactically uncomfortable and personally dangerous, but which sent an unmistakable signal to every officer and soldier in the 62nd Army about what the standard of conduct would be going forward. He later recalled the logic explicitly. If he crossed the Volga himself, his own men would be right to shoot him when he got to the other side. That is either the calculation of a very clear-headed commander, or the performance of one, and in practice, for the soldiers watching, the distinction may not have mattered. The signal was received, the tactic that Chuikov began developing almost immediately, and that would become his most recognized contribution to the military history of the battle was what he later described as hugging the enemy. The principle was straightforward enough to state, though extraordinarily difficult to execute. Keep Soviet frontline positions as close to the German positions as physically possible, close enough that German artillery and German aircraft could not attack Soviet positions without endangering German soldiers. The Luftwaffe's dive bombers the Stuka aircraft that had been one of the Wehrmacht's most psychologically effective weapons across the entire Eastern Front, could not function at distances of 30 meters. The German artillery that had been devastating Soviet formations in open country could not safely fire at targets that were intermixed with German units. By closing the distance, by forcing the battle into the rubble at point-blank range, Chuikov was attempting to strip the Germans of the technological and organizational advantages that had made their combined arms doctrine so effective across the open steppe. It is worth noting here that there is a genuine historiographical debate about how consciously and systematically this tactic was developed versus how much it emerged pragmatically from the specific conditions of the battle. Chuikov's memoirs present it as a deliberate and reasoned doctrine. Some military historians have argued that it was more improvisational, that what Chuikov is doing, in retrospect, is providing a coherent narrative framework for a set of decisions that were actually made under extreme pressure, without the time for the kind of systematic analysis that his account implies. This is not an unreasonable critique of military memoir as a genre. What can be said with confidence is that, whatever the process by which it was developed, the tactic worked, and that Chuikov, who had experience with urban fighting, with the limits of artillery in close terrain, and with the specific weaknesses of combined arms doctrine when the arms are too close to separate, had the background to recognize what was working and to double down on it. The German Sixth Army, commanded by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, had by the autumn of 1942 become the primary instrument of the Wehrmacht's push into Stalingrad. The Sixth Army was, at this stage of the war, one of the most powerful military formations in the German order of battle, well supplied, experienced, and commanded by officers who had driven Soviet forces back across hundreds of kilometers of open ground with a kind of operational fluency that had seemed at times almost impossible to stop. What they were not experienced in was the specific kind of combat that Chuikov was now constructing for them, close range, building by building, floor by floor, sometimes room by room fighting in which the advantages of combined arms, of air support, of artillery coordination, of the operational mobility that had made the Wehrmacht so formidable, all of these were negated or reversed. Chuikov would later articulate this insight in terms that were both precise and vivid. He noted that the Germans had seriously underestimated Soviet artillery. He noted that they had underestimated the effectiveness of Soviet infantry against armored formations in confined terrain. He described tanks forced into narrow streets as guns without mobility, formidable weapons systems reduced by the specific geometry of the battlefield to much of what made them dangerous. And he noted, with the directness of a man who had watched it happen, that the Germans had dropped more than 1 million bombs on Stalingrad, over 1 million bombs, and had not dislodged the Soviet infantry from its positions. The ruins that the bombing created did not clear the defenders. They gave the defenders better cover. On the night before the full German assault pressed deepest into the city, Chuikov's command post was in a tunnel alongside the Tsaritsa River. The Volga was behind him. The German army was in front of him. Several of his predecessors in command of this army had either been killed, relieved, or had found reasons to be on the other side of the river. Chuikov was not going to be on the other side of the river. He had said so out loud, in front of witnesses, and he was aware enough of how institutions work to know that the credibility of that commitment depended entirely on him keeping it. Outside, the city was burning. The 62nd Army diminished, reorganized, holding on by the width of the Volga at its back, was about to discover what it was capable of. And so, under circumstances that no military academy curriculum fully prepares a person for, was its new commander. Chapter 7. The Burning City, the First Weeks of Stalingrad, September 1940. There is a quality to certain kinds of darkness that is different from ordinary night. It is not simply the absence of light. It is the presence of something else, a density, a weight, a feeling that the air itself has changed character. The soldiers who crossed the Volga from the eastern bank to the western bank in September of 1942 described the crossing in terms that carry this quality consistently across multiple accounts. The city on the far bank was on fire. The river reflected the fire. The smoke hung so thick that the stars were invisible. Men in boats crossed through water lit orange from above and felt. Many of them later said that they were crossing into something that was not quite the world they had known before. They were right. Stalingrad in September of 1942 was a different kind of place. A place where the normal categories of military experience no longer applied cleanly, where the tactical manuals that officers had studied at the Frunze Academy and its equivalents were not wrong exactly, but were insufficient in ways that only became apparent when you were standing inside the reality they had failed to fully anticipate. Chuikov had formally taken command of the 62nd Army on the 12th of September, 1942. The German assault that followed 2 days later, the 14th of September, was one of the most intense single-day pushes of the entire battle. German infantry and armor drove hard toward the central landing stage on the Volga, the ferry crossing point that was the 62nd Army's lifeline to the eastern bank for supplies, reinforcements, and medical evacuation. If the Germans reached and held the landing stage, the army's capacity to sustain itself would be effectively severed. The fighting on that day and through the night that followed was conducted at distances measured in city blocks, then in building lengths, then in individual rooms. The central station changed hands multiple times. Some accounts say more than a dozen times in a single day, though the precise number varies across sources. What does not vary is the fundamental character of the fighting: close, grinding, costly, and without the operational sweep that had characterized the German advance across the steppe. The 13th Guards Rifle Division, commanded by Alexander Rodimtsev, crossed the Volga on the night of the 14th and 15th of September and went directly into the fighting around the central landing stage and Mamayev Kurgan, the large hill that dominated the city from its center. The arrival of Rodimtsev's division at this specific moment is one of the more studied episodes of the battle, partly because of its timing. The division crossed while the fighting for the landing stage was still going on, and partly because of what it represented: the Soviet command's willingness to feed reinforcements directly into an ongoing engagement, rather than waiting to consolidate before committing. Chuikov's memoirs describe the arrival of Rodimtsev's men as critical to stabilizing the situation in the central city. Most historians of the battle concur, with the caveat that unstabilizing is a relative term in a situation that remained extraordinarily dangerous for weeks afterward. The landing stage held, the army held. The city did not fall on the 14th of September. Mamayev Kurgan, the Tatar word meaning, roughly, the burial mound of Mamai, a 14th century Mongol commander, rises about 100 meters above the surrounding city and offers commanding views in every direction. In military terms, it was obvious. Whoever held the high ground controlled the observation and firing positions over a substantial portion of the city and the river below. Both sides understood this. The fighting for Mamayev Kurgan began in the earliest days of the battle and continued with varying intensity for most of its duration. The hill changed hands. It changed hands again. It was shelled so continuously from both sides that the soil on its surface was reportedly saturated to a depth of several meters with metal fragments, shell splinters, bomb casings, cartridge cases, a density that years later, when the snow melted each spring, caused the ground to produce iron in quantities that astonished the cleanup teams. That is not a figure of speech. It is a documented physical fact about what sustained artillery and infantry combat does to terrain over a period of months. Chuikov's command post moved during these first weeks more than once, forced by the changing front lines and by the periodic catastrophe of German artillery or air attack. One of the command post locations was positioned on the steep western bank of the Volga itself, partly for the communications advantages of the elevated position, and partly because being immediately adjacent to the river, ironically, provided some protection from German aerial attack. German aircraft could not dive steeply enough to hit targets on the cliff face without risking collision with the bank. This is the kind of tactical detail that does not appear in strategic histories, but that was known at the time to the people whose survival depended on it. Chuikov knew his terrain. He had walked it, studied it, and in those early weeks almost certainly spent time simply standing at the water's edge, looking west into the burning city, calculating distances and angles and the shapes of buildings that still stood. Knowing the terrain of a city is a different skill from knowing the terrain of open country. It requires a different kind of attention, smaller scaled, more granular, more patient. Chuikov had been developing that kind of attention without knowing it since Petrograd. The supply situation in those first weeks was severe. Everything the 62nd Army needed, ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement weapons, reinforcements, had to cross the Volga under fire. The river crossing was roughly 800 meters wide at the main crossing points, and German artillery and aircraft attacked the crossing continuously during daylight hours and intermittently through the night. Soviet engineers and boat crews developed practices over time for minimizing the window of vulnerability, crossing in the darkest part of the night, using multiple routes simultaneously to divide German fire, keeping boats loaded to specific weights to maximize speed. These adaptations were not developed from a manual. They were developed from the experience of watching crossings fail and cross-referencing what went wrong. The Volga crossing operation, at its peak, was one of the more impressive logistical achievements of the entire battle, precisely because it was achieved with minimal formal infrastructure under continuous threat. It kept the 62nd Army alive. The German assault pattern in these first weeks followed a general logic that Chuikov identified early and used to organize his defenses. The Germans preferred to attack in the morning. After artillery and air preparation, with combined infantry and armor, they preferred to advance along streets, the natural corridors of movement through urban terrain, and to use buildings' exteriors as cover. They had, by this stage of the war, considerable experience of urban fighting in other contexts, and they were not tactically unsophisticated, but their doctrine assumed the ability to suppress defenders with firepower before closing with them. And in Stalingrad, as Chuikov was constructing it, that assumption was being systematically undermined. The closer Soviet infantry could get to German positions before the artillery preparation began, the less the preparation could accomplish. The tighter the front lines were pressed together, the more the German combined arms advantage eroded. This was not a comfortable way to fight. It was not a way of fighting that reduced Soviet casualties, but it was a way of fighting that reduced German effectiveness. And in September of 1942, reducing German effectiveness was the mission. Storm groups, small assault teams, typically numbering between 8 and 50 soldiers, depending on the objective, became the primary offensive instrument of the 62nd Army. These were not large formations organized around heavy weapons. They were built around a few assault rifles, grenades, and the ability to move through ruins, through holes blown in walls, through sewers, across rooftops, through the rubble of collapsed buildings, in ways that larger formations could not. Chuikov encouraged his officers to develop the storm group concept and adapt it to specific buildings and specific sections of the city. The result was a fighting style that looked nothing like the mobile combined arms warfare that either side's doctrine had envisioned, and everything like what was actually required by the specific geography of a partially destroyed industrial city on a river. It worked. Imperfectly, expensively, with losses that were sometimes appalling. But it worked. The city did not fall. There is a detail in Chuikov's account of these weeks that appears several times and deserves attention. His repeated emphasis on the importance of his artillery commander, General Nikolai Pozarsky, and on the creative use of Soviet artillery in conditions where conventional fire missions were either impossible or counterproductive. Pozarsky developed techniques for flat trajectory direct fire, essentially using artillery pieces as very large anti-tank and anti-building weapons at close range rather than in the indirect role for which they were primarily designed. The technical constraints of this approach were significant, and the risks were real, but it gave the 62nd Army a capability that German tactical planning had not fully accounted for. The ability to demolish a fortified building at close range with a single direct hit, rather than the extended suppression approach that conventional indirect fire required. In a battle fought in a city of buildings, this was not a minor capability. It was, in several documented engagements, the difference between holding a position and losing it. By the end of September, the battle had settled into the brutal rhythm that it would maintain for the next 2 months. Neither side was capable of the kind of decisive breakthrough that would have ended the fighting quickly. The Germans had the material and organizational advantage in almost every conventional measure, but that advantage was being consumed, day by day, in fighting for individual buildings and floors. The 62nd Army had the advantage of position. Its back to the river meant it could not retreat further without ceasing to exist, which is a particular kind of motivation. And the advantage of a commander who had decided, with full awareness of what he was deciding, that he was going to stay until it was over, or until he was not capable of staying anymore. The city burned. The river reflected the fire, and in the rubble the fighting continued. Chapter 8. Pavlov's House and the Grammar of Ruins. The urban battle deepens, October 1942. War October of 1942 was, in the 62nd Army's experience of the battle, the month in which the nature of the fight became fully clear to everyone involved. The German High Command was pressing hard for a conclusion. Hitler had invested considerable personal prestige in the capture of the city that bore Stalin's name, and the Wehrmacht's southern campaign as a whole depended on securing the Volga, crossing to free Army Group B for further operations. The operational pressure from above was filtering down through the German chain of command into tactical pressure on the units actually doing the fighting, and it showed in the tempo and intensity of the German assaults during October. For the 62nd Army, receiving those assaults across a front that in places was only a few hundred meters deep from the river, October was a month of sustained crisis. Not a single day of it was quiet. Not a single day of it was resolved. The building that became known as Pavlov's house, a 4-story residential building on the 9th of January Square in the central district of Stalingrad, was seized from German occupation by a reconnaissance group in late September of 1942. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov led the initial group of 4 soldiers that cleared the building, and when reinforcements arrived, in total, perhaps 2 to 3 dozen soldiers at various points, from multiple units and nationalities. Pavlov's group fortified it and held it. The building sat in a tactically valuable position on a large open square, with clear fields of fire in multiple directions, and its defenders used those fields of fire with considerable effectiveness. It held for approximately 58 days. The building appears in Soviet accounts, and in most subsequent histories, as a kind of synecdoche for the entire defense of Stalingrad. A small number of determined defenders in a fortified structure, resisting repeated attempts by a larger force to take it. Chuikov himself, in his memoirs, noted that the defenders of Pavlov's house had killed more Germans than the Wehrmacht had lost, capturing an entire European city during the earlier phases of the war. That claim is a rhetorical one and cannot be precisely verified. It appears in his memoir rather than in independent documentary evidence, but the underlying point about the disproportionate cost of fighting for fortified positions in urban terrain is consistent with the broader operational record of the battle. Mamayev Kurgan continued to be one of the most contested pieces of ground in the entire theatre during October. Control of the summit changed between Soviet and German hands multiple times through the month, and in the periods when neither side fully controlled it, both sides held portions of the slope and fired at each other across the distance of a few hundred meters. The fighting on the hill was infantry combat at its most physically demanding. Uphill assaults under fire, into positions fortified with the rubble of the hill's own surface, against defenders who had prepared their ground and knew every fold in the terrain. Casualties on both sides were severe. The hill did not resolve. It simply continued. One of the more sobering aspects of the Mamayev-Kurgan fighting, from the perspective of military analysis, is how thoroughly it defied the expectation that a tactically decisive piece of terrain would, eventually, be decisively taken and held. In the conditions of Stalingrad in October of 1942, even decisive terrain could be contested indefinitely if both sides were willing to pay the cost. Chuikov's command style during this period is described in multiple sources, including post-war memoirs by officers who served under him, as intensely direct. He visited frontline positions frequently, sometimes too frequently for the comfort of his staff, who were responsible for keeping him alive, and found his willingness to be close to the fighting professionally alarming. He demanded immediate and specific reporting, not general assessments, but precise positions, precise casualties, precise weapon states. He was intolerant of imprecision in reporting and intolerant of passivity in response. Officers who framed situations as static were pressed. Why is it static? What would change it? What are you doing to change it? This is not a particularly gentle command climate, and Chuikov was not under any illusion that it was. He had grown up in an institution that used fear as a management tool. He used it too, but the available evidence from subordinate accounts suggests that he also made himself genuinely present, that his expectations were applied to himself as much as to the officers under him, and that soldiers who saw their army commander in the rubble with them drew from that something that reduced their fear and increased their willingness to hold. The reinforcement pattern during October was a constant improvisation. The 62nd Army received several fresh divisions during the month, most of them arriving in conditions of serious depletion. Units that had fought elsewhere and been refitted, or recently formed units with limited combat experience. The quality and condition of reinforcements varied enormously, and integrating them into the ongoing battle without disrupting the defensive positions that had been established required coordination under fire. That was, by any honest measure, extraordinarily difficult. Chuikov and his staff developed a practice of bringing new units across the Volga at night, positioning them in specific sectors within hours of their arrival, and giving their commanders immediate and precise briefings on the tactical situation in their assigned areas. There was no acclimatization period. There was no gradual introduction. Units arrived, and they were in the battle. The ones that adapted quickly contributed to the defense. The ones that took longer to adapt paid for the delay with casualties, and so did the positions they were supposed to hold. This was brutal logic. It was also the only logic available. The industrial facilities in the northern part of the city, the tractor factory, the Barricadi gun factory, and the Red October steel plant, were among the most important contested objectives during October. They were important strategically because they represented Soviet industrial capacity in the Volga region, and important tactically because of their physical character. Vast complexes of reinforced concrete buildings, machine halls, workshop floors, and storage structures that were ideal for fortification and that provided defenders with a geometric advantage against attackers who had to cross the open ground of the factory yards to approach them. Chuikov recognized early that the factory district would be a sustained focal point, and positioned some of his more capable formations there. The fighting in and around the factories during October and into November was among the most intense of the entire battle, measured in meters rather than kilometers, in individual workshops rather than city districts. A note here about sources, because it matters. Much of the granular tactical detail about the Stalingrad fighting in October comes from Soviet-era sources, memoirs, official histories, and unit records that were subject to ideological management at the time of their production. German records, where they can be cross-referenced, sometimes corroborate the Soviet accounts in their basic factual outlines, while differing on emphasis and interpretation. Historians including David Glantz, Anthony Beevor, and Vasily Grossman, the last of whom was a journalist present during the battle itself and whose contemporaneous accounts are considered among the more reliable primary sources available, have worked through these source tensions with varying conclusions. What emerges from the aggregate is a picture that is more complicated than either the Soviet triumphalist narrative or the Western popular account tends to suggest, and that credits the German forces with greater tactical capability and the Soviet forces with greater organizational disorder than either side's preferred narrative acknowledged. Chuikov himself, in his memoir, is more candid about Soviet failures and near collapses than official Soviet historiography was, which is one of the reasons military historians tend to treat his account with qualified respect rather than dismissal. The cold came in October, not the killing cold of a Russian December, but the autumn cold that hardens the ground and puts ice on standing water, and that in a city. without roofs or walls in many of its remaining buildings, makes the bodies of the people inside those buildings spend a significant portion of their available energy on staying warm. For the soldiers of the 62nd Army, who in many cases had been fighting continuously for weeks, the cold was a new difficulty, layered on top of all the existing ones. Supply of adequate winter clothing was a persistent problem throughout the Soviet military in the first years of the war. The system for providing it existed on paper with greater reliability than it existed in practice, and the units on the western bank of the Volga, which received their supplies through the most contested eastern crossing on the entire Eastern Front, were not the units that received priority attention from the logistics apparatus. They received what came. What came was rarely enough. They continued anyway. By the last week of October, the German forces had pushed the 62nd Army's perimeter back to a position in which, in the central and southern sectors, the deepest Soviet penetration west of the Volga measured only a few kilometers. In the northern sector around the factories, the situation was somewhat deeper, but also more compartmentalized. Isolated Soviet pockets holding factory buildings while German forces controlled the territory between them, creating a patchwork of control that made conventional frontline mapping nearly meaningless. The German High Command was optimistic about a final resolution before the winter. The momentum, measured conventionally, was with them. What conventional measurement of momentum did not capture was the specific cost that Chuikov's defensive tactics were imposing on the German forces. Doing the pressing, costs in men, in unit cohesion, in equipment, in the particular kind of organizational fatigue that accumulates when a formation is required to fight day after day in conditions for which it was not optimally designed and in which its advantages are systematically negated. Those costs were real, they were accumulating, and they were about to become the most important variable in the entire Eastern Front. Chapter 9. The Factory District, close combat in steel and concrete, late October to November 1941. The Stalingrad tractor factory had, before the war, been one of the proudest industrial achievements of the Soviet industrialization program. It had been built in the late 1920s and early 1930s as part of the first 5-year plan, constructed with American technical assistance and designed to produce agricultural tractors on an industrial scale, and, as the Soviet military planners always understood, capable of being converted to tank production when necessary. By 1942, it had been producing tanks for over a year. By late October of 1942, the workers had, in one of the most extraordinary documented episodes of the entire war, continued operating their machines while artillery shells were falling inside the factory complex, rolling finished tanks directly onto the factory floor and handing them to crews who drove them straight into combat without the intermediate step of any acceptance testing. That image, a tank rolling from the assembly line into a battle happening simultaneously in the same building, is so extreme that it tends to be treated as legend. The available evidence, including contemporaneous journalist accounts and post-war testimonies, suggests it was true. Chuikov's relationship with the factory district was central to his defensive thinking throughout October and into November. The factories provided what the open street fighting in the central city did not. Defensible structures with walls thick enough to absorb direct artillery fire, with multiple stories that allowed for vertical, as well as horizontal defensive organization, and with the internal complexity of machine halls and workshop floors that made systematic clearance extraordinarily time-consuming. and costly for attackers. The Germans who pushed into the factory district in late October were doing so against defenses that had been shaped specifically to use the physical character of those buildings against them. Each approach route had been studied. Each building had been assessed for its defensive value. The Soviet units holding the factory district were not simply occupying buildings. They were operating inside a prepared defensive system that Chuikov and his engineers had organized with considerable care. The preparation did not make the fighting less intense, but it made the outcome less predictable for the side doing the attacking. The battle for the Barakadi gun factory, which began in earnest in the last days of October, produced some of the most studied close-quarters combat of the entire Stalingrad battle. German infantry units pushing through the factory complex encountered Soviet defenders who had organized resistance at every floor, every window, every internal corridor. Snipers operated from elevated positions within the factory structures with considerable effectiveness. The 62nd Army's snipers, operating under conditions of industrial concealment among the machine frames and overhead cranes of the factory floors, proved capable of disrupting German operational planning at the small unit level in ways that slowed the advance disproportionately to their numbers. The Soviet sniper program at Stalingrad is one of those aspects of the battle that has attracted both genuine historical attention and considerable mythologization. The actual records are incomplete, and the more dramatic individual claims require caution. What can be said with confidence is that organized sniper activity was a deliberate element of Chuikov's defensive tactics, and that it contributed meaningfully to the overall pattern of German attrition. Vasily Zaitsev, one of the most famous Soviet snipers of the entire war, credited in post-war accounts with a large number of kills during the Stalingrad battle, served in the 62nd Army during this period. The precise numbers associated with his record in various sources differ considerably, and some of the more dramatic episodes attributed to him, including a documented duel with a German master sniper, cannot be fully verified from independent sources. What is documented is that Zaitsev was real, that he operated as a sniper in Stalingrad, that he was publicly recognized for his effectiveness during the battle itself, not retrospectively, and that his story was used by Soviet propaganda as an organizing narrative of individual heroism within a collective defense. Chuikov was aware of this use of his soldiers as narrative and encouraged it, understanding that the story of individual men holding specific buildings against specific enemies had a motivational value that aggregate casualty, numbers, and frontline maps could not provide. He was not wrong about this. The supply situation in the factory district presented different challenges from the central city. The distance from the Volga crossings was greater. The internal routes within the factory complex were subject to German observation and fire from multiple angles, and the specific material requirements of the factory fighting. More explosives, more shaped charges for breaking through reinforced concrete walls, specific types of anti-tank weaponry for dealing with German armor in confined spaces, were different from those of the street fighting farther south. Chuikov and his logistics staff adapted the supply system repeatedly during October to address these specific requirements. The adaptation was imperfect. Everything in the 62nd Army during this period was imperfect, but it was functionally adequate. The factory defenses were not abandoned for want of ammunition. They were contested continuously and expensively, but they held. One of the points of genuine historical interest about the factory district fighting is what it reveals about the adaptation of both sides' tactics under the specific pressure of the environment. The German infantry units that pushed into the factories in October were, by the standards of the entire war, experienced and capable. They had been adapting to Soviet defensive methods throughout the battle. By late October, they were using tactics, small assault teams, demolition charges, communication by signal to avoid exposing runners, that bore considerable similarity to the tactics Chuikov's forces were using against them. The battle in the factory district, in other words, was producing tactical convergence, both sides moving toward the same set of techniques, because both sides were facing the same set of physical constraints. This convergence is one of the more intellectually interesting aspects of the battle from a military historical perspective, and it challenges the narrative that presents Chuikov as the unique innovator and the Germans as the practitioners of a rigid doctrine that failed to adapt. Both sides were adapting. Chuikov's adaptations were more effective in the specific context of the 62nd Army's situation, holding at minimum cost with limited resources, but the German adaptations were not negligible. By the first week of November, the Germans had pushed through a substantial portion of the factory complex, and in some sectors had again reached the Volga, cutting the 62nd Army into isolated pockets that were each defended independently without direct overland communication between them. The northern pocket, centered on the tractor factory, the central pocket around the barricade and Red October factories, and the southern groups in the central city. Each of these was receiving its supplies directly from the eastern bank. Each was defending its own perimeter, and communication between them ran through Chuikov's headquarters by radio rather than by the physical connection of a continuous front line. This was a genuinely precarious situation. The operational picture, as it would have appeared to an outside observer looking at a map in early November, was of an army that was technically encircled in multiple sectors, and that had been pushed against a river, with essentially no room left to yield. What the map did not show was the specific quality of the organization inside those pockets. The planning, the preparation, the accumulated tactical knowledge. The commander who was not going to cross the river. The German High Command in early November was, from the available documentary evidence, genuinely optimistic that the battle was approaching its conclusion. Several senior Wehrmacht officers recorded assessments during this period that the 62nd Army was at the limit of its capacity and that a final push would break it. These assessments were reasonable inferences from the visible evidence. The army was compressed, isolated in pockets, under continuous assault, and had been losing ground consistently for 2 months. What the assessments did not account for, because they could not from the outside, was the degree to which Chuikov's organization had built a kind of resilience into its defensive structure that made it capable of absorbing further pressure beyond the point that external measurements suggested was the limit. The distinction between an army that is at the limit of its capacity and an army that appears to be at the limit of its capacity is not easily observable from the other side of a battle. In November of 1942, it turned out to matter enormously. The temperature was dropping. The river was beginning to develop ice in the shallows and at the edges. The supply crossings, already difficult under fire, were becoming physically more challenging as the water level dropped with the autumn and the ice began to complicate navigation. Winter on the Volga was coming, and everyone on both sides of the battle understood what winter would mean. A dramatic increase in the physical demands on every human being, in the area, regardless of which side they were fighting for, combined with a significant change in the operational conditions that had governed the battle since September. Chuikov was preparing for winter. His opponent was also preparing. The difference was that Chuikov's preparation was oriented toward continued defense, holding what he had for as long as necessary, while the German preparations for winter were oriented toward concluding the battle before winter made further large-scale operations impossible. The logic of these two orientations would, within days, be overtaken by an event neither side at the tactical level had been fully prepared for. Something was coming. On the Soviet side, only the very highest levels of command knew what it was. Chapter 10. The Trap Closes. Operation Uranus and the Encirclement. November 1940 TWO Operation Uranus was one of the most consequential military operations of the Second World War, and it was planned under a degree of secrecy that, given the scale of what was being prepared, stands as one of the more impressive intelligence and operational security achievements of the entire conflict. The plan, developed by the Soviet General Staff under the direction of Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, and approved by Stalin in late October of 1942, called for two massive armoured thrusts, one from the north, one from the south, striking not at the German forces inside Stalingrad, but at the flanks of the corridor leading to the city, held by Romanian armies that were substantially less well-equipped and less organisationally resilient than the German formations they were screening. The objective was to close the two pincers behind the German Sixth Army, behind Friedrich Paulus, and the men who had been grinding forward in Stalingrad's rubble for 2 months, and encircle them entirely, not push them out, trap them. Chuikov knew something was planned. He was not told the details. The operational security around Uranus was sufficiently strict that commanders at his level, whose communications, it had to be assumed, might be intercepted, were given only what they needed to know for their specific role. Chuikov's role was what it had been since September. Hold the western bank, hold the city, hold the perimeter. Do not allow the German forces inside Stalingrad to be reinforced or to disengage and redeploy. His job was to be the nail that the hammer could close against. He continued doing it through the first 2 weeks of November, as the German assault pressed on with the same intensity as before, and as somewhere in the vast steppe to the north and south of Stalingrad, the Soviet operational build-up continued behind cover of night and weather, and carefully managed deception. The concentration of armour and infantry that Uranus required was, in scale, larger than anything the Red Army had attempted since before the catastrophes of 1941. Moving it without German aerial reconnaissance, detecting its true character, was a logistical and intelligence challenge of the first order. On the 19th of November 1942, at 0730 hours, Soviet artillery opened fire on the Romanian Third Army positions north of Stalingrad. The bombardment lasted approximately 80 minutes, then the armour moved. The Southwest Front's armour, principally the 5th Tank Army, and supporting formations, broke through the Romanian lines in multiple places within the first hours of the operation. The Romanian units, organised around infantry doctrine, equipped with anti-tank weapons that were inadequate against Soviet armour at this stage of the war, and positioned in defensive lines that had been designed to hold a line rather than to absorb a deep penetration, broke, not everywhere simultaneously, and not without fighting, but the overall coherence of the Romanian defence collapsed within the first day. The Soviet armour did not pause to consolidate each position. It drove south, deep and fast, the way German armor had driven east and west across the Soviet Union in 1941, and the memory of that comparison was probably not lost on the commanders watching it happen. The following day, the 20th of November, the southern arm of the pincer moved from the Stalingrad front, south of the city. Similar conditions obtained. Romanian forces, the Romanian Fourth Army, defending the southern flank, Soviet armor in prepared positions, a bombardment followed by a deep armored thrust. The southern arm drove northwest. The two arms were converging on the town of Kalakon-Don, roughly 80 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The closure, the meeting of the two Soviet pincer arms, happened on the 23rd of November, 1942. The Sixth Army's, roughly 300,000 men, was encircled. The trap was closed. Inside Stalingrad, inside the burning, compressed, fighting city, Chuikov was informed of the encirclement as it developed. The reaction among his soldiers, by multiple accounts, was something that is hard to categorize simply. Relief is one element. The pressure on the western bank of the Volga, the German assaults that had been pounding the 62nd Army for 2 months, visibly reduced in intensity almost immediately after the encirclement closed, as the German command began recalibrating its priorities. But alongside the relief was the awareness that the battle was not over, that the encircled German Sixth Army was still a vast and dangerous force, that the encirclement ring was itself vulnerable to relief from outside, and that the months ahead would require sustained effort at a level that the 62nd Army, after 2 months of continuous attrition, was not in an optimal condition to provide. The encirclement was not the end. It was the turn. Paulus, surrounded, requested permission from Hitler to attempt a breakout westward, while the encirclement ring was still thin, and before the Soviet forces had time to consolidate their positions. The request was denied. Hitler's decision to refuse the breakout, to insist that the Sixth Army hold its positions and await relief from outside, is one of the more analysed command decisions of the entire war, and the analysis has consistently concluded that it was wrong. That a breakout in the final days of November, while the encirclement was new and the ring was thin, had a realistic chance of extracting a significant portion of the Sixth Army. By the time relief became the only option, the window had already closed. The reasons Hitler gave: maintaining the Stalingrad position as a bridgehead for future offensive operations, refusing to appear to be retreating, were strategic rationalizations that did not survive contact with the operational reality. They were also, from the perspective of the 300,000 German soldiers now inside the ring, fatal. For Chuikov and the 62nd Army, the encirclement produced an almost immediate change in the character of the fighting on the western bank. The German formations, now surrounded, were fighting not to capture Stalingrad, but to prevent their own encirclement from becoming a catastrophe, to hold positions, to maintain an airfield for supply by air, and to remain coherent enough as a force to be relievable from outside. The ferocity of the German assaults reduced somewhat, though the fighting did not stop. Chuikov continued to press where he could and to hold where he had to through the closing weeks of November. He was aware that the decisive act had been performed by forces and commanders elsewhere, by Zhukov's operational planning, by the tank armies that had driven through the Romanian lines, by the operational security apparatus that had kept Uranus secret long enough for it to work. His role had been to hold the city long enough for those plans to be executed. He had held it. The city was still Soviet. The Sixth Army was still inside it. And now, in the frozen stillness of a Russian November, the two sides settled into a new configuration. whose resolution would take another 2 months to complete. There is a point that military historians return to consistently when discussing the significance of Chuikov's defense in the context of Uranus, and it is worth making explicitly. Operation Uranus required the German Sixth Army to remain committed to Stalingrad during the period when the Soviet operational buildup was occurring. Had the Sixth Army been permitted to disengage and withdraw from the city in October or early November, had the fighting on the western bank of the Volga not been sufficient to hold the German command's attention and intent, the operational conditions for Uranus would have been substantially different. The plan depended, in a meaningful sense, on the German commitment to taking Stalingrad. That commitment was maintained, at enormous cost to both sides, by the fighting in the rubble and the factories and the ravines of the western bank. Chuikov did not plan Uranus. He did not command it. But the 2 months of defense that he organized and sustained created the precondition that made it possible. That is not a small claim. It is, in the view of most serious military historians of the Eastern Front, a defensible one. The last week of November saw the first serious cold of the Stalingrad winter settle in. The Volga, which had been the lifeline and the barrier simultaneously, began to freeze. But incompletely, in that dangerous intermediate state where the ice is neither clear enough to cross safely nor open enough to navigate by boat. For a period of roughly 2 weeks, the ice crossing that would replace the boat crossing was not yet viable, and the boat crossing was increasingly impeded by the developing ice. The 62nd Army was, during this window, more isolated from the eastern bank than at any previous point in the battle. It remained, through this period, functional and in position. When the ice became thick enough to bear the weight of sleds, and then trucks, the supply situation improved dramatically. The Volga, which had been an obstacle and a vulnerability, had become a road. The stars were visible now, on clear nights, above the frozen city. The smoke from the burning of September and October had mostly settled. What remained was ruin, and cold, and the two armies, and the question of how much longer the encircled Germans could hold out. Chuikov, on the western bank, was still there. He had said he would be. Chapter 11, The Long Winter. The encirclement holds December 1942 to January 1943. Operation Winter Storm. The German attempt to relieve the encircled Sixth Army at Stalingrad, launched on the 12th of December 1942 from positions roughly 60 kilometers south of the encirclement ring. The relief force, organized around the 4th Panzer Army under Erich von Manstein, was the best available option the German command could assemble in the time, and with the resources available. Manstein was, by any honest assessment, one of the most capable operational commanders of the entire war on either side. The force he was given was substantial but not sufficient. The divisions committed to Winter Storm were not all at full strength. The logistical preparation had been rushed, and the distance the force needed to cover before reaching Paulus was greater than the initial assembly areas might suggest, because the encirclement ring had contracted faster than German planning had anticipated. The attempt was serious. It was not trivial. And for approximately 2 weeks of December, it was close enough to succeeding that Soviet commanders at the highest level experienced real concern. Chuikov, inside the city, knew about Winter Storm through the reports passed to him from front headquarters and from the changing character of the fighting on the western bank. The German formations inside the encirclement were ordered by Hitler to hold their positions and not attempt to break out toward Manstein's approaching forces. an instruction that was simultaneously a strategic decision and, in the view of many who have analyzed it, the decisive mistake of the entire Stalingrad campaign. Had Paulus been permitted to break out toward the south, while Manstein was driving north, the two forces might have met. The corridor that would have opened was never tested because Hitler refused to authorize the attempt. Manstein's force drove to within roughly 50 kilometers of the encirclement perimeter before Soviet operational reserves. The Second Guards Army rushed south specifically to address the threat, stopped and then reversed the German advance. By the last days of December, winter storm had failed, the encirclement held. Paulus and the Sixth Army would not be rescued from outside. The Soviet counter-operation that stopped and reversed Winter Storm. Operation Winter Thunder, the response to Manstein's advance, is less celebrated in popular histories of Stalingrad than either the original encirclement or the final German surrender, partly because it occurred simultaneously with several other major Soviet operations, and partly because it did not happen inside the city itself. But it was, arguably, the moment at which the fate of the Sixth Army became definitively sealed. Once Winter Storm failed, the logic of the situation was simple and irreversible. The Sixth Army was encircled. It could not be resupplied by ground. It could not be reinforced by ground. And the airlift that Goering had promised Hitler would sustain it had proved, from the first days of the airlift operation, to be incapable of delivering the quantities of material that 300,000 men required to maintain combat effectiveness. The arithmetic was not complicated. It was simply very large and very final. Inside the encirclement, through December, the German Sixth Army was contracting towards the city as Soviet pressure from outside tightened the ring. The soldiers of the Sixth Army were in conditions that deteriorated steadily and rapidly from the moment the encirclement closed. Fuel was rationed, then effectively exhausted for most purposes beyond essential vehicle maintenance. Food was reduced below subsistence levels. The airlift was delivering, at its best days, perhaps a third of the minimum required tonnage, and on many days considerably less. Medical supplies were inadequate. The cold, the genuine Stalingrad winter, which drove temperatures to -30 and lower, was killing men who had not been issued adequate winter clothing. Frostbite was claiming soldiers in quantities that the medical system could not process. The army that had been pushing into Stalingrad's rubble with such ferocity in October was, by December, fighting on reduced rations, in inadequate clothing, against an encirclement that was tightening daily. The attrition that Chuikov's defense had imposed on them over 2 months of street fighting was now compounded by the attrition of encirclement and cold. For the 62nd Army on the Western Bank, December was different in character from October and November, less intense at the tactical level, but not inactive. Chuikov used the relative reduction in German pressure to reorganize and re-equip his forces as best the supply situation permitted, to strengthen defensive positions, and to conduct limited offensive operations where these could improve the army's position or complicate the German defensive management. The fighting in the factory district continued, though at a reduced tempo. Mamayev-Kurgan continued to be contested. The storm group operations that had characterized the fighting since September remained the primary offensive tool, applied now against an enemy that was increasingly weakened, but still organized and still dangerous. A weakened army in prepared defensive positions is not a trivial opponent. The 62nd Army's operations through December were not easy or without cost, but they were conducted against a force that was no longer capable of the kind of offensive pressure that had defined October. One of the more human aspects of the winter period is what the sources tell us. Cautiously, and with appropriate uncertainty about their reliability, about the morale and psychological state of the soldiers on both sides. Soviet accounts, including Vasily Grossman's contemporaneous journalism, describe a kind of grim steadiness among the 62nd Army's soldiers during this period. The recognition that the operational situation had turned, combined with the exhaustion of sustained combat, producing a state that was neither elation nor despair, but something more like the specific quality of endurance that long, difficult tasks can generate. German accounts from the same period, letters and diaries, recovered later from various sources, describe a deterioration in morale that tracked the deterioration in physical conditions with considerable fidelity. The men who had been advancing through the steppe with confidence in the summer and early autumn were now cold, hungry, and aware, in varying degrees of explicitness, that the situation they were in might not have a positive resolution. The difference between the two armies in December of 1942 was not primarily a difference in their quality as soldiers. It was a difference in their situation. Chuikov's headquarters in December was still on the western bank of the Volga, still within the city, still under the authority of the decision he had made in September, and had not revisited. He had been on the western bank continuously since taking command. He had not crossed. The headquarters had moved several times, forced by German artillery and air attack, but it had always moved to another position on the western bank, never to the eastern bank. This continuity across 4 months of the most intense fighting on the Eastern Front was not an accident or a procedural inevitability. It was a sustained and daily recommitment to a position conducted by a man who was aware of its significance, and of the fact that his soldiers were aware of it too. Whether this affected the outcome in a measurable way is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is that it affected the character of the command and the culture of the army. Operation Ring. The Soviet plan for the final reduction of the encircled Sixth Army was being developed through December and into January. The plan involved concentrating the Don Front's forces and attacking the encirclement from multiple directions, simultaneously compressing the German perimeter systematically until the force inside either surrendered or ceased to exist as a coherent military organization. The planning for Ring reflected lessons that had been learned through the entire Stalingrad battle. The importance of coordination between arms, of systematic preparation rather than rushed assault, and of the specific vulnerabilities of an encircled force, its inability to shift reserves laterally along the perimeter, its logistical dependence on a single airfield, its psychological isolation from the rest of the army. The operation was designed to exploit all of these vulnerabilities in sequence. It was, in military planning terms, a well-constructed piece of work. It was also, given the state of the German Sixth Army by January of 1943, probably not necessary to be as well constructed as it was. The result was fairly predictable by then. The planning was thorough anyway. New Year's Eve of 1942 and 1943 fell on a Thursday. In the city, on both sides of the battle, soldiers marked the date in ways that reflected their respective situations. On the Soviet side, accounts describe modest celebrations. Extra rations where available, letters read and reread the particular reflection that a year's turning invites even in the most extreme circumstances. On the German side, the documentation is more sparse and more somber in its emotional register. The awareness that the year turning had not brought the rescue that had been promised, and that the new year opened not with hope of resolution, but with the deepening cold and the shrinking perimeter and the hunger that was now a physical constant rather than an intermittent deprivation. Chuikov, one imagines, though the sources do not record this specifically, did not spend New Year's Eve sentimentally. He was not, by any account, a sentimental man. He was, by every account, an attentive and relentless one. He would have been looking at his maps. He would have been thinking about what the next week required. Chapter 12, The End of the Sixth Army. Operation Ring and the German Surrender, January to February, 1943. Operation Ring began on the 10th of January, 1943. The Don Front, commanded by Konstantin Rokossovsky, launched the assault against the western face of the encirclement perimeter, with a concentration of artillery that was, at the point of main effort, among the densest of any Soviet operation to that date. The preliminary bombardment lasted approximately 55 minutes. Then the infantry moved. The German defensive positions along the western perimeter had been constructed through the December weeks, with the care and thoroughness that experienced soldiers bring to the work of protecting themselves when they have time, and the knowledge that attack is coming. They were well-built positions. The men defending them were, in many cases, still capable soldiers, despite the deprivations of the encirclement. But the weight of the Soviet assault, the sheer density of artillery preparation, and the depth of the infantry commitment began to compress the perimeter within the first hours of the operation. The compression was systematic. Rokossovsky's forces did not attempt to rupture the perimeter in a single decisive place and exploit the gap. The operational pattern that the Soviets had used in Operation Uranus. Ring was designed differently. A coordinated assault along multiple sectors of the perimeter simultaneously, preventing the encircled force from concentrating its limited reserves at the point of greatest threat. The German command inside the encirclement attempted to manage the pressure by shifting forces laterally along the perimeter, but the forces available for this were limited, both by their numbers and by the physical condition of the men. Frostbitten, underfed, moving on foot across frozen ground while under fire, in temperatures that made every physical action dramatically more demanding than it would have been in temperate conditions. The perimeter contracted. It contracted again. By the middle of January, the Potomnik airfield, the larger of the two airfields within the encirclement, the primary landing point for the airlift, was overrun by Soviet forces. The airlift, already failing to deliver adequate supplies, was now operating through the single smaller field at Gumrak, which had less capacity and worse runway conditions. The situation inside the encirclement passed from severe to critical. Chuikov and the 62nd Army participated in Ring from the east, pressing against the German positions in the city itself, as Rokossovsky's forces pressed from the west, north, and south. This was the 62nd Army's offensive role, not the dramatic armoured drive of Uranus, not the operational encirclement, but the sustained pressure from the city side that prevented the German forces inside Stalingrad from thinning their eastern defences to reinforce the western perimeter against Rokossovsky's assault. It was necessary work, and it was performed. It was also for soldiers who had been in the city since September, and who were now pressing forward through the same ruins they had defended for months. A strange inversion of everything that had come before. They were advancing through Stalingrad. They had been defending it for so long that advancing through it required a recalibration of their spatial understanding of the city. The buildings, they had held were now behind them. The positions they had watched, the Germans' hold, were now in front of them, and the direction of fire had reversed. On the 22nd of January, the Gumrak airfield was overrun. The airlift, such as it was, effectively ceased. The encircled army was now completely dependent on what it had left, with no further possibility of resupply from any direction. The arithmetic that had been unfavorable since December became, at this point, simply conclusive. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler in the last days of January, a promotion that Hitler later acknowledged was intended to signal to Paulus that field marshals do not surrender, they die, sent a message to Hitler on the 30th of January requesting permission to surrender. The permission was refused. On the 31st of January 1943, Paulus surrendered anyway. He was captured by Soviet forces in the ruins of the basement of a department store in the southern part of the city, where his headquarters had been established. He was the first German field marshal to be taken prisoner in the Second World War. The northern pocket, the remaining German forces in the factory district, and the northern parts of the city, commanded by General Karl Strecker, continued fighting for 2 more days after Paulus's surrender. Strecker's forces held out until the 2nd of February, 1943. When they too surrendered, the Battle of Stalingrad was over. The fighting that had begun in the ruins of the city in September had lasted approximately 5 months. The German Sixth Army, which had entered the encirclement with roughly 300,000 men, surrendered approximately 90,000 survivors. The remainder, having been killed, died of wounds, died of cold and hunger, or evacuated as casualties during the airlift operation. The Soviet casualties in the battle, the 62nd Army's casualties alone, as well as the casualties sustained in the encirclement operations and in the relief battles, were, in scale, staggering. The full casualty accounting for the entire Stalingrad operation remains one of the more debated specific quantifications in the historiography of the Eastern Front, and different sources produce different numbers depending on what they include in their accounting. Chuikov's role in the final days of the battle was consistent with everything that had preceded it. He remained on the western bank. He continued to press his sector, and he received the German surrender in his sector directly. The account of these final days in his memoirs is, compared to the intensity of the October and November chapters, almost quiet. The controlled, somewhat exhausted quality of a man recording the conclusion of something enormous. He writes about his soldiers' reactions to the surrender with a specificity that suggests genuine attention. The laughter, the disbelief, the sudden release of tension that had been sustained for so long that its absence felt strange. He records conversations with his officers. He records his own state as something between relief and continued alert. The soldier's wariness about declaring a thing finished before it has fully finished. This quality of wariness, of not relaxing the attention before the situation genuinely permitted it, is consistent throughout his account of the entire battle, and is probably one of the habits of mind most responsible for the fact that the 62nd Army survived. The immediate aftermath in the city itself was, by all accounts, one of the most sobering spectacles of the entire war. The ruins of Stalingrad in early February of 1943 were of a comprehensiveness that had few precedents in modern European history. Entire city blocks had ceased to exist in any meaningful architectural sense. Reduced to variations of rubble, their original shapes discernible only by the regularity of the debris fields. The factories in the north were shells, their interiors destroyed by alternating bombardment from both sides over months. Mamayev Kurgan was stripped of almost every living thing: the grass, the trees, the biological soil layer. By 5 months of continuous artillery and infantry combat, the human cost was present everywhere in the physical environment, in the frost-preserved bodies of soldiers from both sides that lay in many places where they had fallen during the fighting, uncollected because the intensity of combat had made collection impossible. The cleanup of the Stalingrad battlefield would take months, and in some respects, years. For Vasily Chuikov, the conclusion of the Battle of Stalingrad was not the conclusion of the war. He was 43 years old. The Soviet Union had turned the strategic situation on the Eastern Front, but had not resolved it. There were 2 more years of war ahead, and they would include some of the largest military operations in human history. He would fight through all of them. He would command the 8th Guards Army. As the 62nd Army was redesignated in April of 1943, across the southern Ukraine, through the Dnieper crossing, through the grinding campaigns of 1944, and finally, Chapter 13, From Ruins to River, the 8th Guards Army moves west, spring to autumn 1943. The city they left behind was barely recognizable as a city at all. When the guns fell quiet in the first days of February 1943, and the Soviet soldiers who had held the western bank of the Volga through 5 months of sustained fighting finally moved through the ruins without the immediate threat of fire from every direction, what they found was not liberation in the clean sense that the word implies. It was the aftermath of something far older and heavier than a military campaign, something that looked less like the conclusion of a battle and more like the surface of a planet that had been systematically broken down to its constituent materials. Buildings had not been damaged, they had been consumed. Streets were not cracked or pitted. They had ceased to exist as distinguishable from the rubble that surrounded them. The tractor factory, the barricade, the Red October steel plant, each of these structures, which 6 months earlier had been operating industrial facilities, were now the architectural equivalent of geological formations, shapes made of the remnants of what they had once been, reorganized by explosive force into something that had its own strange permanence. The redesignation of the 62nd Army as the 8th Guards Army in April of 1943 was more than an administrative relabeling. Guard status in the Soviet military was a formal recognition of distinguished performance in combat, awarded to units that had demonstrated what the official criteria called mass heroism and steadfastness of personnel. The redesignation reflected an institutional judgment that the 62nd Army's defense of Stalingrad had been genuinely extraordinary, not merely adequate, not merely sufficient, but of a caliber that warranted permanent recognition in the unit's formal designation. For the soldiers who had been there, the designation carried a weight that is hard to fully transmit through historical description. They had earned something. The Soviet state, which was not always generous in its formal acknowledgements of the human cost of its military demands, had in this case said so out loud and in writing. Chuikov remained in command of the newly redesignated army. He would command it continuously through the remainder of the war. Through every operation, every crossing, every campaign, until the army reached Berlin in the spring of 1945. This continuity of command, across 2 years and the full breadth of the Eastern Front from the Volga to the Spree, is itself one of the more notable facts about his career. The Eastern Front went through enormous transformation during those 2 years. The balance of initiative shifted decisively toward the Soviet side. The operational scale of Soviet offensives grew dramatically. The logistics and material situation of the Red Army improved with each passing month as American Lend-Lease supplies arrived and Soviet production recovered and expanded. The army Chuikov commanded at the end of the war was substantially more capable in every conventional measure than the army he had received in September of 1942. He grew with it, or it grew with him, in the particular way that sustained experience of command creates a mutual shaping between a commander and the institution that implements his will. The spring and summer of 1943 brought the 8th Guards Army into the broader operational rhythm of the Soviet strategic campaign on the southern and central sectors of the Eastern Front. After Stalingrad, the army moved into the Donetsk Basin region, the Donbass, as part of the Soviet effort to exploit the strategic shift that the Stalingrad victory had created. The Donbass fighting was of a character different from Stalingrad. Broader front, more mobile, less concentrated on individual urban positions, more dependent on the coordination of multiple arms across larger distances. Chuikov was operating in a context where the tactical principles he had refined at Stalingrad were still valuable, but needed to be integrated with the operational demands of a more fluid and geographically extensive campaign. The transition required adjustment. It was not a transition he resisted. The same quality of attention and adaptation that had characterized his Stalingrad command was applied to the new conditions. The summer of 1943 is dominated, in most histories of the Eastern Front, by the Battle of Kursk, the largest armored engagement of the war, fought in July around the salient that the Soviet winter counteroffensive had created in the German lines. The 8th Guards Army was not the primary formation in the Kursk fighting, which centered on the 1st Tank Army and the forces of the Voronezh and Central Fronts. But Kursk's outcome shaped the operational context within which Chuikov's army operated through the remainder of 1943. The German strategic offensive capacity was definitively broken at Kursk, and from July of 1943 onward, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front rested with the Soviet side. The question after Kursk was not whether the Soviet Union would ultimately prevail, but at what pace and at what cost the remaining German forces in Soviet territory would be expelled. For the commanders doing the pushing, Chuikov among them, the question translated into a sustained series of offensive operations, each requiring the same qualities that the defensive work at Stalingrad had demanded: careful preparation, adaptive tactics, and the willingness to take casualties in service of an objective, while keeping those casualties proportionate to what the objective was actually worth. The crossing of the Seversky Donets River, a substantial water obstacle in the Donbass region, was among the operations the 8th Guards Army conducted in this period. Water crossings were a recurring tactical problem throughout the Soviet advance westward, and the principles Chuikov's forces had developed, or had developed on them, by the necessity of the Volga crossing at Stalingrad, proved transferable. The basic challenge of a river crossing under fire is the same whether the river is the Volga or the Seversky Donets. The force crossings is at maximum vulnerability during the crossing itself, before it has established a defensive perimeter on the far bank. The speed of the crossing, the suppression of the defending fire, and the speed of consolidation on the far bank are the variables that determine the cost. Chuikov understood these variables in a way that very few Soviet commanders of his generation did not, and the quality of his river crossing operations through the 1943 and 1944 campaigns reflected that understanding. By the autumn of 1943, the 8th Guards Army was moving toward the Dnieper, the great river that runs through central Ukraine, and that the German command had designated as the eastern boundary of a defensive line they called the Ostwall, or Eastern Wall. The Dnieper is a formidable obstacle, wide, fast-flowing in its central reaches, with high western banks that give defenders commanding fields of fire over the flat eastern approaches. The German hope was that the Dnieper line could stop the Soviet advance and provide a defensible position that would allow the Wehrmacht to stabilize the front and prevent the kind of deep Soviet penetrations that had characterized the post-Kursk operations. Whether this hope was realistic, given the relative balance of forces in the autumn of 1943, is a question that historians have debated at length. What is not debated is the result. The Soviet forces crossed the Dnieper at multiple points through September, October, and November of 1943, and the Ostwall concept collapsed before it was ever fully constructed. The liberation of Zaporizhzhia, the industrial city on the left bank of the Dnieper in southeastern Ukraine, was among the operations in which the 8th Guards Army participated during this period. Zaporizhzhia had been a site of major Soviet industrial production before the war, particularly associated with the Great Dnieper Dam that had been one of the showcase projects of the Soviet industrialization program. The dam had been destroyed, blown up during the German advance in 1941 to deny its electrical output to the German forces, and the city itself had been under German occupation for nearly 2 years. Liberating it required fighting through an urban environment that, while not on the scale of Stalingrad, presented many of the same tactical challenges that Chuikov's forces had confronted on the western bank of the Volga. The experience of Stalingrad was not a one-time application. It was, as the subsequent campaigns demonstrated, a transferable body of knowledge about how to fight in cities. The honors that came to Chuikov during this period reflected the institutional assessment of his performance. On the 19th of March, 1944, he was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the first of 2 he would receive, specifically cited for outstanding successes in the liberation of right bank Ukraine. It was an award that came from a system not known for understatement in its public recognitions of military achievement, and it arrived in the middle of a campaign that was still actively unfolding. The acknowledgement was real and documented. It exists in the Soviet award record, in the formal citation, with the date and the specific operation cited. It was not retrospective honor. It was contemporary recognition, in the middle of the war, of a commander performing at a level that the highest levels of the Soviet military establishment considered genuinely exceptional. By the end of 1943, the 8th Guards Army was part of a Soviet force that had, in the 12 months since the Stalingrad victory, advanced hundreds of kilometers westward across Ukraine, crossed multiple major river lines, liberated numerous cities, and inflicted casualties on the German forces that were, in the aggregate, unsustainable. The war was not over. There was still more than a year of fighting ahead, and some of the hardest individual engagements. The Vistula-Oder offensive, the Silo Heights, the assault on Berlin itself, lay in the future. But the character of the war had irrevocably changed. The direction of movement had reversed, and the reversal was permanent. The boy from Silver Ponds, who had crossed the Volga Nun, who had stayed when every instinct of self-preservation might have argued for leaving, was now moving west at the head of an army that bore the title Guards, not because someone had given it to them, but because they had taken it themselves in the rubble of a city on a great river in the autumn and winter of 1942. Chapter 14. The Road Through Poland, Vistula to Oder, 1944 to January. 1945 Poland in the summer of 1944 was a country in the process of being traversed by the largest sustained military advance in the history of the Eastern Front. Operation Bagration, the Soviet strategic summer offensive of 1944, launched in late June and destroyed Army Group Center with a comprehensiveness that shocked the German command and altered the entire calculus of the war's remaining duration. The 8th Guards Army was part of the 1st Belarusian Front, commanded by Marshal Vasily Chuikov, and it moved into Poland in the second half of 1944, as the Soviet advance swept westward across the territories that had been under German occupation since 1941. For Chuikov, the Polish campaign represented a qualitative and quantitative leap in the scale of the operations he was commanding, away from the contained, compressed fighting of Stalingrad and into the vast operational sweep of a front whose movements were measured in hundreds of kilometers rather than individual buildings. The character of the fighting in Poland was different again from the campaigns in Ukraine and different again from Stalingrad, though the underlying principles that Chuikov had refined through 3 years of continuous command remained consistent. The Polish terrain, flat to rolling, extensively agricultural in the eastern portions, with periodic urban centers and river lines, favored mobile operations. The Soviet forces in the summer and autumn of 1944 were better equipped for mobile operations than at any previous point in the war. The Lend-Lease trucks that had been arriving from the United States had dramatically improved Soviet logistical mobility. The tank armies had been rebuilt and rearmed, and the communications systems that coordinated the multiple arms of a combined arms force were functioning at a level that would have been unrecognizable to the officers who had tried to manage the same coordination in the chaos of 1941. Chuikov was commanding an army that was simply more capable than the one he had received at Stalingrad, and the operational environment was one in which that capability could be more fully expressed. The 8th Guards Army participated in the liberation of the city of Łódź, Poland's second largest city, in January of 1945 as part of the Vistula-Oder offensive that launched on the 12th of January. The Vistula-Oder offensive was one of the most operationally dramatic single operations of the entire war on the Eastern Front. In approximately 3 weeks, Soviet forces advanced roughly 500 kilometers from the Vistula to the Oder, breaking through multiple German defensive lines and covering distances that, in earlier phases of the war, had taken months. The speed of the advance reflected both the quality of Soviet operational planning, the concentration of force, the depth of the penetration axes, the coordination between the tank armies and the supporting infantry, and the state of the German forces opposing it, which were, by January of 1945, substantially weaker than at any previous point in the war. The city of Poznan, the great fortress city of western Poland, with a medieval citadel that the German command had reinforced and designated as a strong point to be held regardless of the surrounding operational situation, presented the 8th Guards Army with one of its more demanding specific challenges during the westward advance. Zhukov's memoirs record that Chuikov was personally tasked with the capture of the Poznan garrison, a force that turned out to be substantially larger than initial estimates had suggested, where initial Soviet assessments had expected to find perhaps 20,000 defenders in the Poznan fortifications, the actual garrison numbered more than 60,000. The difference between 20,000 and 60,000 defenders is not a minor miscalculation. It is the kind of intelligence failure that, in earlier phases of the war, had cost the Soviet side dearly. In January and February of 1945, with the operational momentum firmly established and the material balance decisively in Soviet favor, Chuikov's forces invested the city, isolated the garrison, and conducted the reduction of the Poznan fortifications as part of a sustained siege, operation that ran concurrently with the rest of the army's advance toward the Oder. The Vistula-Oder offensive's rate of advance placed extraordinary demands on the logistical systems supporting it. An army advancing more than 60 kilometers in a single day, as the 8th Guards Army did on several occasions during the January 1945 offensive, is moving faster than its supply lines can follow in normal operational circumstances. Fuel, ammunition, food, and medical support all require physical delivery, and physical delivery requires roads, vehicles, fuel for the vehicles, and drivers who can operate without sleep across the distances involved. The Soviet logistical apparatus in January of 1945 improved enormously from its state in 1942, was still subject to these fundamental physical constraints. Chuikov's staff managed the tension between operational speed and logistical adequacy with the same pragmatic improvisation that had characterized the 62nd Army's supply arrangements during the Volga crossings under fire. The improvisation was less desperate by this point in the war, but it was still improvisation in the sense that the specific problems generated by each day's advance required specific solutions that no plan fully anticipated. Among the operations of the Polish campaign that deserve particular attention is the 8th Guards Army's involvement in the liberation of the Majdanek concentration camp on the outskirts of Lublin in the summer of 1944. The camp was among the first of the German concentration and extermination facilities to be overrun by Soviet forces, and its discovery confronted the soldiers of the 8th Guards Army, including, ultimately, Chuikov himself, with a category of human activity that was not combat, not the calculated destruction of military forces, but something entirely different in kind. The documentation of what was found at Majdanek was handled by Soviet investigators and journalists who arrived in the days after the liberation, and the accounts they produced were among the first contemporaneous descriptions of the extermination camp system to reach a wide international audience. For the soldiers who found it, the experience produced reactions that the available sources describe with a consistencies that suggests genuine emotional shock. The discovery of something that even soldiers who had been fighting for 3 years, who had seen very large quantities of human suffering and death, found themselves unable to process within any existing category of experience. Chuikov's army had liberated a great many things on its way westward. Majdanek was different in kind. The bridgehead on the western bank of the Oder River, the last major river barrier before Berlin, was seized by the 8th Guards Army and other First Belarusian Front formations in the final days of January and the first days of February 1945. The specific bridgehead in the Kustrin area, on the Oder, roughly 90 kilometers east of Berlin, was held and expanded through February and March of 1945 against sustained German counterattack. This was, again, the kind of fighting that Chuikov's forces understood intimately from the other side of the experience, holding a narrow perimeter with a large river at their backs. under continuous pressure from a force trying to eliminate the bridgehead before it, could be reinforced and used as a springboard for a deeper advance. The Soviets had been on the other side of that situation at Stalingrad. They knew exactly how it felt to press against a defended bridgehead and to be pressed from one. The knowledge was applicable from both ends. The pause between the establishment of the Oder bridgehead in late January and the launch of the Berlin offensive in mid-April was a period of consolidation, replenishment, and preparation. For the 8th Guards Army, it was also a period of relative quiet after the extraordinary pace of the January-February advance. The men who had crossed the Vistula in January and reached the Oder in a matter of weeks had covered in those few weeks more ground than they had covered in several months at Stalingrad. The physical and psychological demands of that pace were real, and the pause on the Oder gave the army something it had rarely had during the war: time. Time to reorganize, to replace losses, to absorb the replacements who arrived to fill the gaps left by the Vistula-Oder fighting, and to prepare for what everyone in the First Belarusian Front understood was coming. The final assault on the German capital. Chuikov spent the weeks on the Oder, doing what he had always done when the operational tempo allowed it: thinking ahead. He had been through 2 years of continuous offensive operations since Stalingrad. He had crossed rivers, liberated cities, reduced fortresses, and advanced more than 1,000 kilometers westward in command of the same army. He was 45 years old. The metal fragment in his left arm had been there for 25 years. He had a second hero of the Soviet Union on its way, its formal award date the 6th of April, 1945. Berlin was roughly 90 kilometers to the west. The final chapter of the European War was not yet written. He could see it from where he was standing. The 8th Guards Army's specific assault axis in the Berlin operation would take it through the Silo Heights, the last major defensive line east of Berlin, which the German command had fortified with the care and thoroughness of men who understood that what lay behind it was the capital of the Third Reich, and that there was nothing beyond the capital worth defending. The fight for those heights would be the hardest fighting Chuikov's forces had faced since the factory district of Stalingrad. It was waiting for them in April. Chapter 15, The Gates of Berlin, the Silo Heights, 16th to 19th. April 1945. The Silo Heights rise approximately 48 meters above the Oder River's floodplain. Not a dramatic elevation by any standard of mountain warfare, but enough on the flat terrain of Brandenburg to constitute a commanding defensive position that anyone approaching Berlin from the east must either capture or circumvent. The German commander, General Gotthard Heinrici, who had replaced Heinrich Himmler as commander of Army Group Vistula in March of 1945, a transition that replaced ideological appointment with genuine military competence at what turned out to be the last possible moment, correctly predicted that the main Soviet thrust would be made along the Reichsstrasse, one road at the Silo Heights, and organized his defense accordingly. He thinned the defensive lines elsewhere and concentrated his best remaining forces, his anti-tank emplacements, and his artillery on the heights themselves. He also flooded the floodplain below by releasing water from a reservoir upstream, turning the approach ground into a swamp. The Germans were outnumbered, outgunned, and operationally outmatched by the Soviet forces building opposite them. Heinrici had organized the best defense available with what he had. It was, in the end, a formidable one. The Soviet assault force assembled for the Berlin operation was of a scale that is difficult to convey without numbers And numbers in this context require a moment of context to be meaningful. The three Soviet fronts participating in the Berlin operation collectively fielded approximately 2 million, 500,000 men, 6,000, 250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, and more than 40,000 artillery pieces and mortars. The 8th Guards Army, positioned directly opposite the strongest part of the Silo Heights defenses, where the Reichsstrasse 1 passed through the escarpment, was part of Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front. Chuikov's formation was one of several assault armies concentrated against the heights, alongside the 5th Shock Army and the 2nd Guards Tank Army. The weight of force assembled against the Silo Heights was not subtle. It was, in the tradition of Soviet operational planning, by 1945, a deliberate application of overwhelming mass against a position identified as critical. The offensive began on the 16th of April, 1945, in the early hours before dawn. The preliminary bombardment was conducted by approximately 9,000 artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers, and over 500,000 shells were fired in the first 30 minutes. Zhukov had ordered that the assault be conducted at night, with 143 searchlights used to illuminate the terrain and blind the German defenders. The searchlight concept proved problematic in practice. The dust and debris thrown up by the bombardment reflected the light back at the advancing Soviet forces, reducing their visibility rather than improving it. This is the kind of tactical detail that tends to be omitted from triumphalist accounts of the final Soviet offensives. The specific ways in which carefully planned operations encountered unexpected obstacles. And it is worth noting precisely because it corrects a narrative of effortless Soviet superiority in the war's final phase. The Silo fighting was not effortless. It was among the most costly operations of the entire Berlin campaign. A further complication emerged almost immediately. The German defenders had, according to information from Soviet prisoners captured the day before the assault, been warned of the attack date. Heinrichi had pulled his frontline troops back to the second defensive line before the Soviet bombardment fell on the first line. The same tactic, in reverse, that Chuikov had used at Stalingrad, drawing the German forces into close range to negate their advantages. The artillery preparation, however devastating in absolute terms, therefore fell largely on positions that had been vacated. The Soviet infantry, advancing behind the bombardment, encountered a defended second line rather than a destroyed first line. The swampy floodplain slowed the armoured support. The heights beyond were higher than some commanders had fully anticipated in their planning. By early evening of the 16th, despite advances of 4 to 6 kilometers in some sectors, the second German defensive line remained intact. Zhukov was forced to report to Stalin that the battle was not going as planned. Stalin, in response, told Zhukov that he was considering allowing Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front, advancing from the south, to direct its tank armies northward toward Berlin, implying that Zhukov might be bypassed if he could not break through quickly. This was, by any reading, a deliberate application of competitive pressure between Soviet commanders. It worked in the sense that it accelerated the operational tempo on Zhukov's front. Whether that was the right management decision at that specific moment is something that Soviet and post-Soviet historians have debated at considerable length. On the 17th of April, the 8th Guards Army's 4th Guards Rifle Corps, working alongside the 11th Guards Tank Corps of the 1st Guards Tank Army, found a narrow avenue of exploitation on the right flank of the 8th Guards sector, and advanced, taking advantage of a local success to push through the second defensive line at a point where the German resistance was thinner. This was exactly the kind of tactical adaptation to local conditions that Chuikov had been refining since Stalingrad, identifying the specific point where the resistance was weakest, concentrating available force there, rather than applying it uniformly across the front and driving through the gap before the German command could shift reserves to close it. The exploitation was not large, measured in a few kilometers, but it was real, and it contributed to the cumulative pressure that, by the evening of the 17th, had broken the Germans' second defensive line in the sector. By the 19th of April, after 3 days of fighting that produced some of the highest Soviet casualty rates of the entire Berlin operation, the Seelow Heights were taken, and the road to Berlin lay open. The German Ninth Army, which had defended the heights, was increasingly enveloped as the First Belarusian Front broke through, and the First Ukrainian Front swung north, and the encirclement of the German forces east of Berlin began to close. The 8th Guards Army had taken significant casualties during the Seelow fighting. The Liberation Route Europe source describes the losses as heavy, and the operational record confirms this. But it had done what it was tasked to do: break through the strongest defensive line east of Berlin and advance toward the city. Berlin, from the 19th of April onward, was no longer protected by a continuous defensive perimeter east of it. It was defended only by what was inside it. What was inside it, as the Soviet forces would discover in the days that followed, was a city of approximately 3 million people, a garrison of varying quality and substantial numerical strength, composed of Waffen-SS divisions, Wehrmacht remnants, police formations, the Volkssturm home guard of elderly men and young boys, and, in several locations, fanatic units that had decided to fight to the end regardless of the operational reality surrounding them. The city was also, physically, one of the largest urban environments in Europe, a metropolitan area far more extensive than Stalingrad, with a different geometry of streets and buildings, different defensive characteristics, and a different history in the mind of every Soviet soldier who was now approaching it. For Chuikov, standing east of Berlin in the final days of April 1945, the question of how to fight in a city was not a new one. The principles he had developed on the western bank of the Volga were about to be applied to the capital of the state that had made the Volga fighting necessary. The approach to Berlin from the east and southeast was accomplished through the last days of April, as Soviet forces drove through the Brandenburg suburbs and outer ring defenses toward the city center. The 8th Guards Army advanced toward Berlin from the southeast, along with the 1st Guards Tank Army. On the 23rd of April, Berlin was fully encircled. The battle within the city proper began. For the 8th Guards Army, which approached from the direction of Tempelhof Airport and the Teltow Canal, a significant water obstacle running through the southern suburbs. The assault into Berlin was a condensed repetition of the experience that had formed the army's identity. Urban combat, close range, building by building, with the accumulated knowledge of everything Stalingrad had taught, applied to a new city in the closing weeks of a war that was, by every measure, already decided. Only the dying was still being done. The 3 days at the Seelow Heights had been the last major set-piece battle of the European war. Everything that followed, Berlin, the final weeks, was the working out of a conclusion that had been reached some time earlier. Chuikov knew this. His soldiers knew it. The German soldiers defending Berlin, many of them, knew it too. The knowledge did not, unfortunately, make the fighting stop. It simply meant that every casualty in those final weeks was incurred in service of a result that was no longer genuinely in question. That is a specific kind of military tragedy, Not the tragedy of uncertain outcomes, but the tragedy of certainty, of knowing that the arithmetic has already resolved, and watching it continue to demand its payment anyway. Chuikov had seen this before, in a different form, in the months when the Sixth Army was encircled and the outcome was clear. But the fighting went on. He had been on the other side of that particular mathematics then. Now he was on this side. The mathematics was the same. Chapter 16. The Last City. The Assault on Berlin and the German Surrender. April to May 1945 Berlin, in late April of 1945, was, in physical terms, a city that had already been substantially altered from its pre-war character. 3 years of Allied strategic bombing, concentrated most heavily in the period from 1943 onward, had destroyed large portions of the residential and commercial districts. The great civic buildings, the Reichstag, the Reich Chancellery, the government quarter along the Wilhelmstrasse, were standing but damaged, their windows long since blown out, their facades pocked and scarred, their interiors stripped of everything removable. The streets were cleared in places, and blocked in others, by the rubble of demolished buildings that had been pushed to the sides by the city administration in the months before the Soviet assault, in a recognition that the streets needed to remain passable for military traffic, even as everything else was failing. Into this city, larger than Stalingrad, historically more charged, defended by a force that included some units of genuine quality, alongside many that were shadow formations, held together by organizational inertia, and the alternative of execution for desertion, came the 8th Guards Army in the final days of April 1945. The assault across the Teltow Canal in the southern suburbs of Berlin, in which the 8th Guards Army participated, was one of the more technically demanding, specific operations of the Berlin battle. The Teltow Canal is a substantial water obstacle, not the width of the Volga, but wide enough and deep enough that a direct crossing under fire required the same engineering preparation and the same acceptance of vulnerability during the crossing itself that had defined the Volga crossings at Stalingrad. Soviet combat engineers prepared the crossing under fire, bringing bridging equipment forward through streets that were contested by German defenders, using every available building as a firing position. The crossing was accomplished. The bridgehead was established. The 8th Guards Army moved into the southern districts of Berlin and began the block by block, floor by floor process of clearing the city that Chuikov had designed at Stalingrad and applied in every urban battle since. The specific experience of the Berlin street fighting, as opposed to the Stalingrad street fighting, had several distinctive characteristics. The buildings in Berlin were in many cases more solid than those in Stalingrad, which was a newer industrial city with substantial amounts of timber frame construction mixed with the industrial concrete of its factories. Berlin's older residential and commercial districts were built of the dense Prussian brick construction that had been standard in northern European urban architecture since the 19th century. Multiple stories, thick walls, basements that extended beneath the street level, buildings designed to last centuries rather than decades. These buildings, when converted to defensive positions, were genuinely formidable. The storm group tactics that Chuikov had developed at Stalingrad required adaptation for the specific geometry of Berlin. Different approaches to building clearance, different use of demolition charges to breach walls, rather than fighting through windows and doorways. Different coordination between the assault infantry and the direct fire artillery that supported them at close range. The adaptation was made. The clearing proceeded, slowly block by block, with casualties on both sides. One of the most documented single episodes of the Battle of Berlin is Chuikov's meeting on the 1st of May, 1945, with General Hans Krebs. Krebs arrived at Chuikov's headquarters before dawn that morning, carrying a white flag and a sealed message. He was the Wehrmacht's acting chief of the General Staff, a position that placed him, nominally, at the very top of the German military hierarchy in the final hours of the Reich. He informed Chuikov, in the course of the meeting, of two things. First, that Adolf Hitler had died on the 30th of April, and second, that the new German leadership under Goebbels and Bormann was seeking conditions for a ceasefire that would allow negotiations. Chuikov was, by his own account, the first Allied officer to learn of Hitler's death. He immediately conveyed the information up the chain of command to Zhukov, who conveyed it to Moscow. Stalin was informed in the early morning hours of the 1st of May. The meeting with Krebs is one of those moments that sits at the intersection of military history and the kind of human detail that makes the past feel genuinely inhabited. Krebs arrived at the headquarters of the man who had commanded the defense of Stalingrad, in the ruins of the city whose fall had been one of Hitler's most explicit strategic obsessions, and announced that the man who had ordered that obsession was dead. The irony was not lost on those present, and Chuikov's account of the meeting is, for a military memoir, unusually attentive to the human dimensions of the exchange. The formality of the German officer, the weight of what he was communicating, the strange quietness of the moment in the middle of a battle that was still actively being fought in the streets outside. Chuikov rejected the German request for ceasefire terms because he had no authority to grant terms. The Soviet position was unconditional surrender, and that decision rested at a level considerably above an army commander. He told Krebs this. Krebs returned to the German side. He did not survive the final days of the battle. The Reichstag, the building that had symbolized both the democratic aspirations of the Weimar Republic and the institutional shell within which those aspirations had been destroyed, fell to Soviet forces on the 30th of April. The specific formations that took the building and raised the Soviet flag above it were units of the 3rd Shock Army, not the 8th Guards Army. Chuikov's forces were advancing through the central government quarter by this point, but had not been the first to reach the Reichstag. This is one of those details that matters somewhat for the historical record, and somewhat not at all for the larger assessment of Chuikov's role in the battle. The Reichstag is the symbol. The battle was the substance. The substance was distributed across the entire assault, and the 8th Guards Army's contribution to it was substantial by any honest accounting. On the 2nd of May, 1945, the formal end came in Chuikov's sector. General Helmuth Weidling, who had been appointed commander of the Berlin defense area in the final days of the battle and who had been attempting to coordinate the increasingly fragmented German defenses. As the Soviet ring tightened around the government, Korte arrived at Chuikov's headquarters. He arrived on foot, which was itself a statement. The city was so completely in Soviet control that the commander of its garrison could walk through it only by walking toward his captor. He signed the capitulation of the Berlin garrison. The fighting in Berlin, with some exceptions in isolated positions, stopped. Chuikov, who had accepted the beginning of the end at Stalingrad, when Paulus sent his first surrender request, now accepted the formal surrender of the capital of the state that had caused that beginning to be necessary. The arithmetic had completed its calculation. The 2nd of May, 1945, was the answer. The scale of what had been accomplished between September of 1942 and the 2nd of May 1945, 2 years, 7 months, in the same command, across the full width of the Eastern Front, is one of the remarkable facts about Chuikov's career and the career of the 8th Guards Army. In that time, the army had gone from the compressed perimeter on the western bank of the Volga to the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. It had crossed the Volga, the Seversky Donets, the Dnieper, the Vistula, the Oder, and the Spree. It had fought in Stalingrad, in the Donbass, in Ukraine, in Poland, in Brandenburg, and in Berlin. It had done all of this under the same commander, who had taken it when it was nearly destroyed and had brought it to Berlin. That is the kind of continuity that institutional memory is built from. Chuikov was 45 years old on the 2nd of May, 1945. He had been a soldier for 28 years. He had spent the war on the fighting side of the front. Not in a rear area headquarters, not in a planning staff, but in command of fighting formations. From the Volga to the capital of the enemy, the metal fragment in his left arm had been there for 25 years. The prayer that would be found among his belongings 37 years later. The one about turning night into day and making difficult things easy was presumably already somewhere in his possession. The night he had entered when he crossed to the western bank of the Volga had, on the 2nd of May, 1945, turned into something that resembled, cautiously and exhaustedly, day. Chapter 17, The Occupation Years and the Cold War Soldier, 1945 to 1960. The transition from wartime command to occupation duty is one of the stranger transitions in a military career, and for officers of Chuikov's generation. It required adjustments that went considerably beyond the administrative. The war had been, for all its horror, a context that was operationally clear. The enemy was identifiable, the mission was defined, the measure of success was concrete. Occupation duty in post-war Germany was something considerably more ambiguous. A role that sat between military command and political administration, between the management of a defeated population and the beginning of a new geopolitical confrontation that was taking shape even before the last German surrender documents were signed. Chuikov spent the years from 1945 to 1953 in Germany, initially commanding the 8th Guards Army in the Soviet occupation zone, and then, from 1949 to 1953, serving as Commander-in-Chief of the group of Soviet forces in Germany, the title that placed him at the head of the entire Soviet military presence in occupied East Germany. The Soviet occupation of Germany in the immediate post-war years was a period of extraordinary historical complexity that Soviet historiography, for understandable institutional reasons, did not address with complete candor during the years when that historiography was being produced. The behavior of Soviet forces toward the German civilian population in the initial occupation period, the mass requisitioning of German industrial equipment for transport to the Soviet Union, the structure of the Soviet military administration in Germany. All of these aspects of the occupation have been studied more fully since the opening of relevant archives in the 1990s, and the picture that emerges is more complicated than either Soviet or Western Cold War era accounts conveyed. Chuikov's role in all of this as a senior commander, the degree to which he shaped, resisted, or simply executed the policies he was given, is not something the available sources address with the specificity that would allow confident characterization. What is documented is his position and his authority. What he did with that authority in the specific situations the occupation presented is largely inference from the institutional context. The Cold War was not slow in making itself felt in Germany. The Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949. The Soviet attempt to cut off West Berlin from Allied overland access, which the Western powers countered with the Berlin airlift, occurred while Chuikov was in command in Germany, though before he had risen to the position of commander-in-chief of the group of Soviet forces. The blockade and airlift were, in military terms, the first significant direct confrontation between the Soviet Union and the Western powers in the post-war period, and they established the pattern of the early Cold War. Competitive, occasionally aggressive, but ultimately bounded by the mutual awareness that the alternative to competition was something far worse than competition. Chuikov was a senior figure in the Soviet military presence that made the blockade possible. The airlift, from his perspective, was the demonstration that the Western powers were not going to yield on Berlin. The blockade was eventually lifted. The lesson about Western resolve was noted, though the degree to which that lesson was absorbed and applied by Soviet military and political leadership in the years that followed is a matter on which historians differ. His appointment as commander-in-chief of the group of Soviet forces in Germany in 1949 placed him at the head of the most significant single concentration of Soviet military power in the Western theater, the force that sat across the frontier from the nascent NATO alliance, and that, in Soviet strategic planning, was the primary instrument of any potential westward military action in Europe. Managing that force, in the specific conditions of occupied East Germany in the early 1950s, required a different kind of skill from anything that had been demanded in the actual war. It required political sensitivity. Navigating the relationship with the East German political leadership, which was simultaneously a Soviet client and an organization with its own institutional interests and anxieties. It required diplomatic awareness, operating in a context where every decision had potential implications for the broader Soviet-Western relationship, where the line between military posture and political signal was blurry and consequential. It required, in other words, the kind of multi-layered competence that Chuikov had actually been developing since his first China posting in the 1920s. The soldier from Silver Ponds had, over the course of a career that had taken him from the factory floor in Petrograd to the ruins of Berlin, accumulated a range of experience that prepared him, more than most of his contemporaries could claim, for the specific demands of the early Cold War military role. He returned to the Soviet Union in 1953 to take command of the Kiev military district, the military command responsible for the Ukraine region, one of the Soviet Union's most strategically significant military districts, given both its proximity to the western frontier and the economic and demographic importance of Ukraine to the Soviet state. He held this command from 1953 to 1960, a period that coincided with the most significant political transformation of the post-Stalin Soviet Union. The death of Stalin in March of 1953, the subsequent power struggle, and the eventual emergence of Nikita Khrushchev, the same Khrushchev who had been present at the September 1942 meeting when Chuikov was given command of the 62nd Army as the dominant figure in Soviet politics. The relationship between Chuikov and Khrushchev during this period is an interesting dimension of his post-war career that the available sources do not address in great detail. What is documented is that Chuikov continued to hold major commands through the transition and into the Khrushchev period, which implies at minimum that his professional standing survived the political changes that accompanied and followed Stalin's death. The promotion to Marshal of the Soviet Union came on the 11th of March, 1955. The rank of Marshal was the highest in the Soviet military hierarchy, below the non-functional wartime rank of Generalissimo that Stalin had awarded to himself. There were, at any given time during the Cold War, only a small number of active marshals, and the rank carried with it both substantial formal authority and the kind of institutional prestige that, in the Soviet system, translated into real influence on defense policy and military planning. Chuikov receiving this rank in 1955, in the context of a post-Stalin Soviet military establishment that was simultaneously reorganizing its command structures and beginning to think seriously about the implications of nuclear weapons for conventional military doctrine, was a recognition that his standing in the institutional hierarchy remained at the highest level. The construction of the Mamayev-Kurgan Memorial Complex, the enormous Soviet memorial to the Battle of Stalingrad on the hill where the fighting had been so intense in 1942, began in the late 1959 and continued through the 1960s, culminating in the installation of the great statue known as the Motherland Calls, which was unveiled in 1967. Chuikov was a major consultant for the design of the memorial. His involvement was not ceremonial. The available accounts indicate that he engaged substantively with the design process, drawing on his direct knowledge of the terrain and the fighting to ensure that the memorial's physical relationship to the landscape accurately reflected the historical reality of the battle. There is a particular quality to the involvement of a man who actually commanded troops on that hill in contributing to the design of a memorial that will sit on that hill for generations. He was not interpreting history. He was, in a specific and direct sense, the history being memorialized. By 1960, Chuikov had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Ground Forces and Deputy Minister of Defense, the institutional peak of a conventional military career in the Soviet system, the position from which the entire land army of the Soviet Union was commanded. He held this position from 1960 to 1964. He was simultaneously appointed head of Soviet civil defense in 1961, a position he would hold until his retirement in 1972. These two roles together, commanding the ground forces while simultaneously heading the civil defense apparatus, reflected a Cold War strategic reality in which the distinction between military and civilian vulnerability was collapsing under the logic of nuclear weapons. The civil defense portfolio, in the context of 1961, was not primarily about natural disasters. It was about the possibility of nuclear attack. Chuikov, who had spent his entire adult life thinking about how to defend things, cities, positions, armies, was now thinking about how to defend an entire country from the most destructive category of weapons ever devised. The problem was the same in form, if radically different in scale. From 1961 until his death, he was a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, nay, the formal governing body of the Soviet state, the membership of which placed him at the intersection of military authority and political power. He was present in this capacity for the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, for the escalating tensions of the mid-1960s, for the Soviet military buildup of the late 60s and early 70s. He was not a political figure in the sense of being primarily a party operator. He was a military figure whose authority warranted a place in the party's central deliberative body, and he occupied that place until he was no longer capable of doing so. He retired from active duty in 1972. He was 72 years old. He had been a soldier for 55 years. Chapter 18. The Last Years, The Burial on the Hill, and The Measure of a Life, 1972 to 1982, and Beyond Retirement, for a man who had been in continuous military service since the age of 17, is a different kind of experience from retirement for someone whose life has contained other registers. Vasily Chuikov in the 1970s was a man without a formal command for the first time in 5.5 decades. The institutional structure that had organized every day of his adult life, the regiment, the army, the front, the headquarters, the chain of command running upward, and the chain of responsibility running downward, was no longer the frame within which he operated. What replaced it in the years between 1972 and his death in 1982 was the slower work of memory, the organization of what he had seen and done into a form that could be passed on. He wrote. He consulted on memorial design. He spoke to historians and journalists. He was present as a living embodiment of the events the Soviet Union was simultaneously commemorating and managing the historical interpretation of, at commemorations of the Battle of Stalingrad that grew in scale and formality as the decades since the battle increased the distance between the event and the living memory of it. His memoir writing during this period produced 2 significant works. The first, published in English translation as The Beginning of the Road, covered the Stalingrad battle specifically and remains one of the primary source texts for any serious study of the Soviet defense of the city. The second, known in translation as The End of the Third Reich, covered the final campaigns from the Vistula to Berlin. These memoirs occupy an interesting position in the historiography of the Eastern Front. They were produced within the constraints of Soviet publication, which meant that certain things could be said and others could not, that the political context within which events occurred was subject to management, and that the overall narrative was expected to conform to the broad outlines of official Soviet historiography. Within those constraints, Chuikov was, by the standards of Soviet military memoir, unusually candid. He acknowledged near collapses, command failures, executions of officers, and operational difficulties, with a directness that makes his account more, rather than less credible to the scholars who have cross-referenced it with other sources. He was not writing a polished official history. He was writing the account of a man who was there, and who remembered it in the specific, uncomfortable detail that direct experience produces. He attended the funeral of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1969 as the head of the Soviet delegation, a moment that carries its own particular resonance. Eisenhower had commanded the Allied forces in Western Europe during the war, coordinating the campaigns that had pressured the western face of the Reich, while Chuikov's forces ground through the eastern one. The 2 men had operated in the same war, at the same rank of broad theatre command, on different fronts. They had never met on the battlefield, but the war they had fought together, in the sense that their respective campaigns were part of the same strategic whole, was the defining experience of both of their professional lives. Chuikov standing at Eisenhower's funeral in 1969, representing the country that had suffered more than any other in the conflict they shared, was an image that contained more history than the protocol of a state funeral visit conventionally implies. The metal fragment in his left arm, the one placed there by a wound in Poland in 1920, carried for 61 years, untouched by the surgeons who had assessed it over the decades as too dangerous to remove. Developed septicemia in 1981. The infection was systemic and serious. He was 81 years old. The 9-month illness that resulted was By the accounts available, genuinely debilitating for a man who had spent his entire life in physical motion and operational engagement. He died on the 18th of March, 1982, in Moscow. The cause, formally, was the infection. The origin, going back 61 years, was a bullet fired somewhere on the Polish front in the Russian Civil War. When he was 20 years old, and the Soviet Union did not yet exist, the decision about where to be buried was his own. He had made it, apparently, well before his death, with the deliberateness of a man who had been thinking about Mamayev Kurgan for decades, not just as a place where he had commanded troops, but as a place that had a specific claim on him. He had fought there. Men under his command had died there. He had consulted on the design of the memorial that now dominated the hill. And he had decided, at some point in the long retirement that followed the long war, that he wanted to be buried there. Among them, not at the Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, where many senior Soviet figures were interred. Not at the Kremlin Wall. At Mamayev Kurgan, on the hill above the Volga, in the soil that had been saturated with metal in the autumn and winter of 1942. The motherland calls. The enormous concrete statue that stands on the summit of Mamayev Kurgan, designed by the sculptor Yevgeny Vuchetich and standing approximately 85 meters tall, was completed in 1967, 2 years after the end of Chuikov's tenure as Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Ground Forces. At the time of its completion, it was the tallest statue in the world. The figure depicted a woman striding forward with a sword raised, her mouth open in what reads as either a call to arms or a cry of grief, depending on the angle from which you see her, was positioned by Vuchetich specifically to face west, toward the direction from which the German attack had come. Chuikov's burial site on the hill below the statue faces the same direction. The man who held the western bank faces west, in perpetuity, in the ground that his holding made possible. There is a historiographical question that serious scholars of the Eastern Front return to with some regularity, and it deserves direct engagement rather than avoidance. How much did Chuikov's personal command actually matter? The counterfactual question, would a different commander have lost Stalingrad? And if so, would the war have ended differently? Is, as all counterfactuals are, ultimately unanswerable. What can be said with some confidence is that the specific decisions Chuikov made in the specific conditions of September, October, and November of 1942, the decision to stay, the decision about command proximity, the development and application of the hugging tactic, the use of storm groups, the organization of the supply crossing, the management of the army's command culture under extreme duress, were not predetermined by circumstances. They were choices. Other commanders in similar positions had made different choices, with different outcomes. The 3 deputies who had crossed to the eastern bank when Chuikov arrived were not cowards in any simple sense. They were responding rationally to a situation that appeared to be reaching its limit. Chuikov assessed the same situation and responded differently. That difference is what history has, rightly, been trying to account for. What the prayer found among his belongings after his death suggests, if we are careful about what kind of evidence a prayer can provide, is that the directness and apparent imperturbability of Chuikov's command style concealed an interior life that was less certain, less armored, less resolved than the external presentation implied. Make every difficult thing easy for me, and help me. These are not the words of a man who believes his own legend. They are the words of a man who is asking for help with something he is not sure he can manage alone. The specific source of the prayer, whether it was a text he had encountered somewhere in his readings, or something he wrote himself, or something he had known since the village of Silver Ponds. We do not know. The fact of it, that this was among his private possessions when he died, is documented. It is probably the most humanizing single detail in the entire historical record of his life. Not because it contradicts the soldier, but because it completes him. The city of Stalingrad was renamed Volgograd in 1961 as part of the de-Stalinization program under Khrushchev. The renaming was, for people like Chuikov, who had fought for the city by its previous name, an administrative action whose full emotional weight is not easy to assess from the outside. The name Stalingrad had been, during the battle, more than a geographical designation. It had been an argument, a statement of what was at stake, a declaration that this specific location carried the name of the state's leader, and therefore its meaning. The battle had been partly about names, about symbols, about what the city represented beyond its physical existence on the Western Bank. Prepared using Claude Sonnet 4, 6 if you have completed the previous 6 chapters else. First continue, that then stop. The previous set of chapters, 13 through 18, was delivered in full, but chapter 18 ended mid-sentence. The final paragraph was cut off. Here is the completion of chapter 18, followed by the closing of the full documentary script. Chapter 18 continued. The last years, the burial on the hill, and the measure of a life. The city of Stalingrad was renamed Volgograd in 1961 as part of the de-Stalinization program under Khrushchev. The renaming was, for people like Chuikov, who had fought for the city by its previous name, an administrative action whose full emotional weight is not easy to assess from the outside. The name Stalingrad had been, during the battle, more than a geographical designation. It had been an argument, a statement of what was at stake, a declaration that this specific location carried the name of the state's leader, and therefore a meaning beyond its coordinates on a map. The battle had been partly about names, about symbols, about what the city represented beyond its physical existence on the western bank of the Volga. Renaming it did not change what had happened there, but it altered the public grammar of remembrance in a way that people who had given specific things in that specific name would have felt quietly and without anywhere obvious to put the feeling. Chuikov continued to speak and write about the battle through the 1970s with a consistency of emphasis that suggests genuine conviction rather than performed loyalty to an official narrative. His core argument that the defense of Stalingrad was not primarily a product of political will from above or abstract patriotism, but of specific tactical and organizational decisions made in the field, under conditions that were genuinely uncertain, by real people who had to choose, was not the argument that Soviet institutional historiography was most comfortable with, since institutional historiography tends to prefer explanations that credit the system rather than the individual judgment of commanders. Chuikov insisted on the individual dimension. He insisted on the specific decisions, the specific moments, the specific choices that he and his officers had made in the rubble, because he was the one who had made them, and he understood, perhaps more clearly than the historians, writings about them from a distance, that they could have been made differently. The outcome was not inevitable. It had been made. His two Hero of the Soviet Union awards. The first granted for the liberation of Right Bank, Ukraine, the formal date, the 1944. The second granted specifically for the Berlin operation, the formal date, the 6th of April, 1945. Placed him among the relatively small group of officers who received the award twice during the Second World War. He also held the Order of Lenin 8 times, reflecting the accumulated weight of an entire career's worth of formal recognition within the Soviet decoration system. These honors are not, in themselves, the measure of his significance. The Soviet decoration system was, like all such systems, imperfect and subject to political and institutional pressures that did not always align perfectly with genuine military merit. But the aggregate, the consistency of formal recognition across 4 decades of command, from the Civil War orders of the Red Banner to the Marshal's baton, suggests a professional standing that was not manufactured retrospectively, but built across an entire lifetime of demonstrated performance. What is the honest assessment of Vasily Chuikov, arrived at from the distance of more than 80 years since the events that defined his reputation? He was not a gentleman. The institution that formed him used fear as management tool, and he used it too. The command climate he created was demanding to the point of severity. And the severity was not always discriminating between the officers who deserved its pressure and the officers who were doing their best in impossible circumstances. He operated within a political system that made demands on its military officers that went beyond the purely professional, and there is no evidence that he refused those demands or that he substantially subverted them. He was a man of his time, formed by his institution, shaped by the specific catastrophes that the 20th century chose to concentrate in the specific corner of the world where he was born and grew up and served. To expect him to have been something the institutions of his time and place had no mechanism to produce is to apply a standard that is more satisfying than it is historically honest. What he was, within all of those limitations and constraints, was genuinely extraordinary in the specific context that history assigned to him. The autumn of 1942 on the western bank of the Volga was a specific kind of challenge, one that demanded a specific combination of qualities that not many people possess simultaneously: the tactical intelligence to identify and implement the hugging doctrine, the physical and psychological endurance to remain on the Western Bank through 5 months of continuous crisis, the command authority to hold an organization together when the organizational pressures toward dissolution were as strong as any that a military formation can experience, the judgment to know when to yield ground and when not to yield it, and underneath all the formal qualities of command, the simple willingness to stay, the decision, made privately and renewed every day for months, that this was the place and this was the time, and he was not going to leave. He is buried at Mamayev Kurgan, in the soil of the hill above the Volga, where the fighting was hardest. Below the great statue of the motherland that faces west, in the company of the soldiers he commanded. The inscription on his grave identifies him with the city he held and the army he commanded, the 8th Guards Army. Stalingrad. The words are enough. He had asked to be there, and the Soviet state that he had served for 60 years granted the request. He rests on the hill that he never left, when leaving was still possible, in the ground of a city that the Volga still runs beside, that the winter still comes to each year with the patience of all things that have no reason to be in a hurry. The river does not remember. The hill does not commemorate. The men and women who come to stand on Mamayev Kurgan and look out over Volgograd, over the rebuilt city, the new streets, the ordinary life that has grown back over the ruins, the way grass grows back over disturbed earth. Bring the memory with them when they come, and carry it back when they leave. And somewhere in the records of a life that began in a peasant village called Silver Ponds and ended in the spring of 1982, There is a small folded piece of paper with words written on it in Russian. Oh, the one who can turn night into day and earth into a flower garden. Make every difficult thing easy for me and help me. A prayer carried by a soldier for how long we do not know. Through how many battles we cannot say. Found among his belongings at the end of a life that had contained more difficulty than most human beings are asked to hold. The request had apparently been granted. The night had eventually turned into day. The difficult things had been made. Not easy, exactly, but possible. He had made them possible. And then, in the spring of 1982, he had rested.